Sometimes, the ocean keeps its darkest stories not in the depths below, but in the memories of those who survived it. Last time, we heard a tale whispered in the dim forecastle of a storm-tossed steamer, a story of shipwreck, cannibal tribes, and a white girl stolen by a monstrous chief beneath the moonlit palms. It was a story so terrible that even hardened sailors fell silent. But the sea never lets one story end where it begins. When the wind calms and the smoke of horror drifts away, another voyage always calls. From the haunted islands of the Solomons to the crowded harbors of Sydney and the wide green coasts of New Zealand, our narrator drifts on a violinist, a vagabond, a dreamer chasing sound and survival across the edge of the world. This is not merely a tale of travel, it's a confession of youth, of hunger, music, and the strange beauty that clings to those who have lost everything but wonder. So stay with us, as the storm fades and the bow turns toward a new horizon. The sea has more to tell. Welcome back, everyone. I'm really glad to see you here again. If you enjoy what we do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps more than you think. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you love, or even what you don't, about the stories we bring to you. Alright, no more waiting. Let's dive back into a vagabond's Odyssey, and continue the journey together. Visited many places during my wanderings in New Zealand, among them the beautiful Bay of Akaroa and many other romantic scenes. The New Zealand bush is wild and grand enough, and the Maoris deeply interested me. I visited one aged Maori warrior, called Mati. Samoan tattooing was nothing compared to the engraving on his big frame. He spoke English perfectly, but said little. He had kind, deep-set eyes and a wrinkled face that was also deeply carved. Indeed, he looked like a stalwart bit of brownish Greek sculptural work, covered with hieroglyphics. When he moved with majestic precision, curves of artistic tattooing joined his stern, straight nose to his chin and upward to his eyebrows. He was the one surviving warrior of a time when New Zealand was a real Maori land, when the beautiful legendary lore of today was poetical reality to the land's original race. Mateen had fought with the tribes while fleets of canoes were ambushed in the Gulf. At Rotorua too, I interviewed Maoris in their native people. They wore but few clothes. The girls and women had good-looking, stoical faces. The Maoris strongly resemble the islanders of the Samoan and Tongan groups. Indeed, so pronounced is the likeness that one cannot help thinking that the two races are allied by blood ties, and probably drifted from New Zealand to the Pacific Isles, or vice versa, ages ago. For several weeks, I went off on my wanderings, accompanied by my beloved comrade, my violin. I had still a pound or so in my possession, which I intended to keep for the rainy day that would be sure to darken the blue sky of glorious vagabondage. So, while the skies were bright, I made my bed in the bush, and by the light of the moon, read Byron's poems. I had bought a paper-covered edition of them in Wellington, and carried them in my violin case. Oh, the romantic splendor of those days and nights, when I drank in the Byronic atmosphere. The glorious illusion of youth, the rosy glamour that is not what it seems, and seems what it's not, hung about me, as I sat under the giant cherry trees by the track, or approached the Maori stronghold with Don Juan sparkling in my eyes. On the West Coast ranges, North Island, I came across a bushfallers camp. I walked across the slope and introduced myself to the solitary occupant, an old Irishman. He turned out to be an interesting and congenial member of the wandering species. His camp was pitched by a creek that led to a lake, the banks of which were surrounded by beautiful ferns, eucalyptus and trees covered with fiery blossoms musical with the moan of bees. As we sat together and sunset touched the lake waters with fire, and primeval silence brooded over the forest, broken only by the weird note of birds, I could easily have imagined that I and my comrade occupied a new continent alone. Parakeets went shrieking across the forest and over the lake. We only saw their shadows in the still water and heard the tuneless beak scream as they passed overhead and left a deeper silence behind. I stopped with the bushfaller one night. "Goodbye, mate," he said, as he looked up to me with his grateful, round blue eyes and placed my gift in his pocket. He had told me where there was a Maori paw several miles away, and had come stumbling with me through the undergrowth for a long way, to direct me to the track that led to the main road. That same evening I came across several old warrays, by a sheet of water, at the foot of a tremendous range of hills that rolled to the southward. It was extremely hot weather, and, as I followed the track round by the water's edge, I saw the little Maori children paddling by the lake shores as the native women were fishing. On the other side of the lake were several wooden homesteads where some whites live. I walked into the Maori village, and the children stared stolidly at me as they stood by the shed doors. Presently I came across an old Maori chief sitting under a mangrove. He looked very aged, possibly more so through his face being carved with dark blue tattoo. He spoke English well, and as I approached he welcomed me and said, "Play me your music." I at once sat down by him and began to talk. As we were speaking, a crowd of Maori girls came round us, and some men, who wanted to hear me play the violin. The old chief took me into his dwelling. It was strikingly clean. I saw his wife squatting in the corner, reading a book printed in the Maori language. She was a very ugly old woman, and when she smiled, revealed bare gums that seemed to reach to her ears. Her hideousness intensified the youthful beauty of the Maori girls, who came rushing into the PA while I was speaking to the old man. They were beautiful girls, with the usual fine eyes, and a marvelous wealth of hair that glistened over their bare shoulders and fell to their bosoms. The sight of them reminded me of my pretty Maori girl, who had long haunted my dreams. I stayed near that settlement for several days, and attended the rehearsal of a canoe dance. The weird beauty of that scene in many ways recalled memories of the fantastic sights I had seen in the South Sea Islands. One night, when the moon was shining over the lake and forest, the Maori girls came forth from the PA, attired in scanty robes of woven grass and flowers reaching to their knees. Across the forest patch in front of the PA they ran with bare feet, waving their arms and singing a chant in their native language. Then lying down in a row, prone, in the deep grass, they moved their bodies and arms as though to imitate canoe paddling, all the time chanting a Maori melody. It was an unforgettable sight, the moonlight glimpsing over their bodies as the night wind lifted their luxuriant hair. They looked like mermaids paddling in seaweed at the bottom of an ocean of moonlight. All the while, the Maori men gazed with admiring eyes. I heard many Maori songs. They struck me as being full of a wild, poetic atmosphere that suggested tribal battles, and the legendary sadness of far-off deeds of passion and love. I give here a few bars of melody which may faintly express my memory of their music. I recall the solemn grandeur of the New Zealand bush, the cry of the melancholy curlew in the forest as I tramped along the wild tracks to road. I had my violin with me, and in the strange perspective of memory, I still hear and see the romping, sunburnt bush children rushing out by the bush homesteads to welcome the troubadour who had suddenly appeared. Once or twice I got pretty hard up, and had to resort to my violin's appealing voice for help. Not far from a little bush township, by a range of hills that rolled to the westward, I came across another paha where my fiddle and I were welcomed by the old Maori chiefs, whose blinking eyes lit up their tattooed faces. I remember I was warmly received by that primitive community. It seemed hard to believe that they were descendants of bloodthirsty cannibals as I sat among them and accompanied their songs that breathed tenderness and poetry. The character of their music strikingly resembled Samoan melodies I had heard sung by the Siva chorus girls in the South Sea villages. The following suggests the atmosphere of Samoan or Maori music. I will tell you a native fairy tale, as nearly as I can remember, just as the pretty mouth of Mako, the Maori girl, told it to me. One evening she was singing sweetly while I strummed a tinkling accompaniment on my violin. The shadows were falling over the forest cherry trees, and across the slanting roofs of the warrays, and the sunset fire blazed the lake waters, until they seemed a mighty burnished mirror, that reflected the Maori village, with its sloping roofs and the romping children on the banks. "Goodbye, Mako. I must go home now," I said at last, and the old chief Mako's father looked up as he squatted with his back against a tree and said, his tattooed wrinkled face smiling, You stay in PA till tomorrow." "All right," I replied. And then Mako's eyes shone with pleasure, and her bunched hair flew out in the soft forest breeze as she ran across the patch into the wari to peel the potatoes and boil corn cobs for supper. After supper, the kind old chief and his pretty daughter sat by me on the slope. The moon shone over the lake and was reflected in the still water, wherein the gum trees stood upside down in a shadow world. Sitting on the grass, with her chin on her knees and her romantic eyes staring straight in front of her, Mako started to chant to herself. "Come on, Mako," I said. "Tell me some more fairy tales." She laughed, then grew very earnest, for she always imagined she was the heroine of the tales she told. Then, facing me and looking into my eyes, she began. "Long, long ago, out of the sea rose the head of a beautiful youth. His eyes were 2 stars, which he had stolen one night out of the sky. Running up the shore, he looked on the land and clapped his hands with delight to see the beautiful trees and all Hirashiyate Marino so peaceful. And as he stood looking, the water dripping from his body in the golden sunlight, he said, 'Where is she? Where is she?' Then all the wari flowers on the big trees suddenly heard and looked down, for they had turned into the faces of beautiful girls, and they opened their mouths and cried together, 'I am she, I am she.' Then the beautiful youth of the sea looked up at them closely with his wide open eyes, and said, 'You are not beautiful enough, not any of you. She whom I love has eyes made out of the sunsets, and the stars all shine in the dark night of her hair. So go away, go away.' And all these beautiful girls cried bitterly, and shrank up and were only flowers again. Then the boy from the sea, Takaroa, shouted once more, 'Where is she? Where is she?' And all the caverns along the shores and the mountains echoed back sadly to him, 'Where is she? Where is she?' Then Takaroa lay on the shore in the deep grass and cried to himself, and fell asleep. In the morning, when the great sunrise was shining over the sea, and all the mountains inland were on fire with golden light, he was awake, and, jumping up, he lifted his hands to the sky. 'O God of the sky, where is she? Where is she?' And at once a little hee-hee bird came flying across the forest sky and, sitting on the poatukawa tree just above the beautiful youth, started to sing sweetly on its twig. Takaro listened, and looked up and said, 'Are you my love?' And the little bird started at once to swell, its feathers all puffed out, and it grew and grew. Then lo, out jumped a beautiful girl. Oh, so lovely she was, said Mako, as she stopped and looked at her imaged face in the moonlit lake. For, as I told you, she always would believe that she was the beautiful heroine. Then she continued. Her hair was like the tangled forest with the stars shining in it, and her eyes more beautiful than the sunset. Oh, oh, you are my love, you are my love. Sing to me, the immortal youth said, and side by side they sang together. Then he plucked a bamboo cane and made a magic flute, and she sang and danced. Oh, how beautiful you are, he said as he looked upon her lovely body. And she said, Do you love me, Takaroa, or my body? And he said, Oh Tomo, me weary, I love you, not your body, but your beautiful eyelight. Then all day they danced and sang together. Then night came, and he made a lovely soft bed for her, and she lay down on the gray moss and curled up her warm limbs. The beautiful youth lay down beside her and kissed her red coral lips and said, Oh, my love, place your arms round me. And she said, I dare not, oh I dare not. But still he pleaded, and he was as beautiful as was his voice. So she relented and put her arms out and sighed, and he clasped a little bird. Oh, how he cried, and cried, for in the gray moss was still the impression of the beautiful girl's body. And though the little bird had flown away, he still kept looking down at the gray moss bed, and crying out, Oh, come back to me. But the little bird came not back, and he was alone with the silent night. And all around him the old giant trees, with gnarled trunks, sighed and moaned in the moonlight with deep windy voices as the wind blew through them. For they were the stalwart warriors, the long dead tattooed chiefs, who had once lived in the world of love and grief. Then Mako looked once more into the lake water at herself, and the tears were in her eyes, and the old tattooed chief's eyes blinked in the moonlight as we sat together and looked at each other. I cannot show you the surrounding forest and the deep stillness of the waters, or paint the moon that shone over the lake, or Mako the Maori girl's romantic eyes and face. Presently Mako looked up into her father's face and said, "Poirot, tell us a tale also." And immediately the old chief, who longed to outrival his daughter, for the Maoris seemed to live chiefly that they may dream of far-off battles and tell weird legends, began and told me how this world got into our universe. Before the very beginning of things, a mighty god was walking across the clouds in the sky. He had not slept for thousands and thousands of years. So he put his giant feet against some stars that twinkled between his toes, and with his head pillowed on the roaming cloud, sat and rested, and his shadow moved across the sky like a mountain man, wherever the cloud moved along, and obscured the fixed stars in its passage. On and on he went for thousands of years, resting, which to the mighty god was only like a tiny rest of 1 minute. Then he suddenly said, "Oh, I do feel tired." And as he slowly rose to his feet and obscured all the Milky Way, he yawned, and lo, out of his mouth, to the mighty god's own surprise, jumped thousands of tiny boys and girls. Round and round the god they swam in space, with gleaming eyes and laughing voices. And then, suddenly growing tired, they too cried, "We are tired, give us something to sit upon." The old god sighed, and on his breath came all the stars of the lower firmament. And he shed tears at the thought that he had become sleepy, and yawned, and made boys and girls come. And those tears made the great seas beneath him. Then, as the children cried again, the great earth heaved up silently under him also, and he threw the moon into the sky. Still the children cried out, "Oh, we are so cold." So he tore out one of his eyes and threw it into the sky, and lo, the great sun shone and warmed them. Then they said, "Oh dear God, we are hungry." And the god sighed again and touched a fleecy cloud, and out jumped thousands of woolly sheep. And from his new clouds of moonlight he plucked bunches of glittering wings, and birds soared, singing across the new sky. Still they cried, "Oh dear God, we want something else." And then something else, and the great god became terribly fierce and shouted the thunder. Then the rain fell. Still the children were unsatisfied, and the god said, "All right, you shall grow old and ugly." And when they understood what that meant, they cried loudly to the god for forgiveness. So he relented and said, "Though you must grow old and ugly, you shall have little children to take your place." And they clapped their hands for joy. But still they were unsatisfied. And he got fierce again and said, "You shall fall asleep, and your bodies turn to flowers, and trees, and dust." And then at last they felt a little more satisfied, because when they found that they had to leave the beautiful world forever, the stars, the flowers, the trees, the ocean and the sunsets became sad and seemed more beautiful to look upon. And so the first old Maori men and women got very ugly and crept into the earth to die quite satisfied. Thus finishing, the old chief licked his dry lips and sang me a chant, as he lived on in some past age, and Mako looked at him tenderly and sang softly with him. They looked like two children together, and not father and daughter at all. They lived in a dreamland and cared for nothing else, for they lived within themselves. Eventually I bade the Maori world farewell, and arrived at Christchurch, where I was forced to stay for 2 or 3 weeks, for whilst gazing at a derrick that was hauling up a huge coping stone, slipped and sprained my ankle, and was laid up for a week, and thereby got into low water. In the house in which I was lodging, there was also staying a retired actor, who was, like me, in extremis through the lack of the essential wherewithal. This old actor was an amusing man, always cheerful and a good companion. He was a man of about 60 years of age, and when I sat on the side of my bed and played my violin to him one evening, his eyes gleamed with intense pleasure. "Bravo, youngster," he said, and in his extreme delight his clean-shaved face wrinkled up with happy thought. "Fancy you talking about being hard up when you can play the fiddle like that." Immediately he unfolded a plan, which was to give concerts in public without any preliminary expenses. In common parlance, we agreed on the spot to go buskin'. The idea of playing in the streets of a city was not congenial. It lacked all the romantic troubadour element of my previous experiences in the little bush towns upcountry. But nevertheless, my companion's cheerfulness and optimism gave me courage. He had a remarkably good voice, and in our room we rehearsed all the songs that he knew. Together next night, with our wild harps slung behind us, we sallied forth. My comrade had brushed his antiquated tall hat up till it shone with renewed prosperity. He had also cut out of paper a pair of new white cuffs, for he had a great belief in looking respectable. "My boy," he said, "we must let them see that we are not allied in any way to common plebeian street players. How do I look?" Then he gazed at himself in our looking-glass with pride, while I told him that he looked the last kind of man to be singing in the street. I meant what I said too, for he had a very distinguished look, and his speech had the intonation of bygone Polish in it. In the heart of the city, by the curbside, we started the first open-air concert. It was after dark, and the well-lit street was thronged with people, who generously dropped coins into my partner's tall hat. For as soon as he had finished singing, he went into the crowd. As I played on, whether it was my comrade's melodious voice, or my violin playing, or our respectable appearance, I know not, but I was astounded at the money he collected. After each pitch, we retired into a bar and counted out the proceeds and shared alike. My comrade smacked me on the back with delight, as he continually had another drink. "Don't you think we had better finish now?" I said, as I noticed that he was getting a bit excited. But he would not hear of such a thing. At the next pitch, by the arcade, he started to shout out, going through his old parts. He even opened his mouth and went through Hamlet. The vast crowd that collected to watch his antics stopped the traffic, and the police moved him on. "We had better get off," I said to him, and to my great relief, he agreed. Just as we were turning a corner, an aristocratic-looking old gentleman came up to us and, touching me on the back and saying, "You play the violin rather well for the streets," got into conversation with us. He invited us up to his residence, where we had a good supper, and my friend entertained our host with reminiscences of better days. We were invited to stay the night, and left next morning as guests. I did not go out with my friend anymore, but at once sought for a post. I eventually secured a good orchestral job as violinist. I also got into society, and played drawing-room solos at a residence, where the hostess was a person of very high standing in Christchurch. One day while I was playing a violin solo to her daughters in the drawing-room, the door suddenly opened, and a loud-voiced lady swept into the room, bringing a pungent odor of scent with her. She looked at me hard for a moment, then put on her pince-nez, and once more surveyed me critically, saying, "Dear me, how you do resemble the young man who is playing a violin in Queen Street with another awful man. I do not recommend violinists to go buskin', if they can do better and wish to rise from the vagabond state. If they do, they will be recognized long after they have forgotten the incident themselves. To have even your ability recognized is sometimes distressing." I remember being awarded the first prize in an amateur violin solo competition at Bathurst, in New South Wales. I played Paganini's Lost Reg, and his violin concerto in D.I. was awarded the first prize by the adjudicator. Then someone recognized me as a professional, and I was immediately disqualified. I remonstrated, but an old program was produced, whereon it was stated that I had been special court violinist to the kings, queens, and high chiefs of the South Sea Islands. I think that is the only time in my career that my position as first violinist and composer to royalty has ever been recognized. Also the only occasion when the musical and critical ability of the royal houses of the Southern Seas, through choosing me as their court violinist, has ever been acknowledged. Many things happened during my New Zealand wanderings, and one incident stands out in stronger, yet sadder relief than many of the others as I dive and grope back deep down in the silent waters for my dead sea fruit. You will admit, I am sure, that I have not gone into rhapsodies over my virtues, but verily I believe the worst of us are better than we seem. One day I was resting against a tree by the track. I was on my way to Wellington, to reply personally to an advertisement that offered a good salary to a violin dance player. It was a long, weary road and I was very tired, but happy, for I had about a sovereign in my possession. I had been reading my Byron and Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, to which I had written music, notwithstanding that the ode was the utterance of music itself. For when we are young, we rush forward to paint the cheeks of the gods, and teach wise old bushfallers philosophy. I was feeling lonely and poetical, which, in the worldly sense, means slightly insane. The world seemed to have a glamour of poetry about it after all. The grandeur of the somber forest bush seemed a part of me, as the old, gnarled giant trees stood silently in the gloom, like wise old friends staring at me. Who would protect my homelessness if they could? The sun was blazing hot, and just as I was thinking that, I only had the silent butterflies for companions in a magic world of bright flowers and wise old trees. A tired-looking girl came round the bend of the track. As she was passing me, she looked quietly into my face and smiled. I had never seen her before, so you may guess a good deal about that smile, and not be far wrong in thinking that Mrs. Grundy's unprivate opinion is a correct one. It was a one smile, and as weary-looking as the feet of the owner of the smile, as they dragged along the dusty bush track, as though they cared not where they led the wretched body. I looked up and returned the smile, for the eyes of the girl were brown and earnest. She came straight up at once and sat down beside me. "I suppose you haven't a shilling or so to spare, sir?" I looked at her kindly, I am sure, and, with the quick intuition of her sex, her manner immediately changed. She saw that I returned the smile in a spirit of woeful fellowship only. She was a good-looking girl, about 24, 2 or 3 years older than I. Her hair was glossy and thick, and to this day I remember her fine brow and the look that lighted up her face. She had a pretty, yet weak mouth, but the stars shone on the dim horizons of her eyes. As she looked long and earnestly at me, I got up and said, "I'm off. I've got to get to Wellington." And away we went along the track side by side. I asked her a lot of questions about herself, and she answered me truthfully, telling me that she was a 3/4 caste Maori girl. I should never have noticed it if she had not told me so. Her father was an engineer and had been killed in an accident, and her mother had taken to drink and gone to the devil. I saw by her manner and by all she said that she wanted to impress me with the disadvantages she had had in her brief career. Also that she regretted that first familiar telltale smile. I looked much older than I was, for I was tall, well-made, with thick bronzed hair, gray eyes and sensitive curved nostrils and lips. Indeed, I possessed all those physiological defects that have made me what I am. For to get on in this world, one should have square nostrils and a protruding bulldog jaw, and eyes with a mental squint that can scan north, south, east and west of one's world of prospects all at once. Yet I was happy enough, untrammeled, and out of the grip of conventionality. That relentless old man of the sea could not cling to me. My soul roamed at will, like a riderless wild horse, across the plains of life. And as I was romantic, and the glamour of Byron's gallant corsairs sparkled in my head, attuned to the tenderness of Keats, I spoke of the beautiful sunset and the goodness of God, and gazed down on the frail derelict beside me trudging along in her dilapidated shoes. How I remember her earnest eyes as she looked up at me. Most assuredly, the great poets are really the sad, truthful Bibles of this world. For the tenderness, the atmosphere, of their inspired minds still sighed out of their graves into my heart, like the scent of the flowers growing over them. Her voice became soft and sighed with mine, and, God knows it's true enough, I was never so proud and religiously happy as when that bad woman's eyes gazed up into mine with admiration my eyes. Indeed, oh we men, who write as though she would do that which we would never do. Presently we saw the wooden houses of a township ahead, and as we entered the little main street, ignoring the curious looks of the stragglers who were leaning against the verandas of the few shops, sheltered by their big-brimmed bush hats, I took her into an eating house where we ate together. She became very silent, and when we started off again, down the main road, I noticed that tone of respect in her voice that we give to those who we think we realize are better than ourselves. So I started to sing cheerily and made her laugh. We arrived at the outskirts of Wellington at dusk and stood under a lamp. I gave her several shillings. She refused to take them at first, until I said, "That's all right, I lend it to you." She clutched my hand, looked up at me quickly and then hung her head and cried, like a child. I soon cheered her up and made her promise to write to me, saying, "I am a musician and can make plenty of money. I thought you were something great like that. You've got the look in your face." And she looked at me as though I was some wonderful being. We were standing outside a third-rate theater, and I asked her if she would like to see the play. As she said she would, we went in, the loose street woman and I. When we came out, I said goodbye to her, and she got on a car to go to some friends. She seemed so happy as she looked back at me. She did write to me, and I gathered that she had obtained a situation in a boot factory. They were neatly written letters, and how I recalled the soul, the woman part of those letters, and what they really meant. But suddenly they ceased. How I pray that her life after that was a happier one than that of the gallant corsera she met on the bush track in New Zealand long ago. As I look back, I see again the weary face of that neglected girl. Her eyes are looking at me. I did not love her then, but, strange as it may seem, I love her passionately now. Her shabby skirts and the bit of dirty-colored blue ribbon round her throat are sacred memories to me, and the old dilapidated shoes are shuffling a dusty song on the weary track. A song so unutterably sad that I think Christ must have composed it. I think God gathers all his beauty from grief, that, enthroned in loneliness, he gazes eternally across his stars and across his dark infinities and sees some long ago. For not in the vastness of things, or the mighty ocean of space, can we see or feel so much of infinity as we can see in the derelict eyes of the friendless, as I saw and see now, in the tramping Maori girl of my spiritual passion. How I love the memory of those imaginative boyish days. I often wonder if many boys were, and are, as I was, and see the strange things that I saw. My earliest recollection is of the little bedroom at the top of the house where I slept when I was 6 or 7 years of age. On moonlight nights, I could see the poplar trees swaying to the wind outside my window as I lay alone in bed. Just beyond the trees was a stable, and its chimney had a large cowl on it. That cowl was shaped like a helmet, and had ribbed marks on it, like deep wrinkles on an old man's throat. And as the wind blew, it turned slowly and majestically round. I used to peep from the sheets out on the moonlight night with frightened, awestruck eyes, for my childish brain firmly believed that it was God's head moving against the sky watching me whenever it turned towards my window. I told my mother about it, and they all assured me that it was only a chimney cowl. But still, I did not like the look of it, and I was delighted when they shifted my bed into another room. At another time, I stole some green apples off a tree in our garden and got very sick and ill. My dear mother made me promise to steal apples no more, and she said to me, "Though I cannot always see you, God can, for he is always walking about everywhere." "What is he like?" I asked, and then she described him. Not long after that, I was going up a lonely lane near our house, when I suddenly spied some green gooseberries in a long front garden. Being a born vagabond, I opened the gate and crept in, and kneeling down by the bushes, I stole a pocketful of the unripe gooseberries. Just as I was bolting off, an old gentleman with a long white beard, who held a walking stick to help him along, quietly opened the gate, walked in, and looked at me with solemn eyes. I stood before him trembling like a leaf, quite certain that God stood before me. I hung my head with shame and said, "Oh God, I am so sorry, please forgive me." And then I saw a kind look in God's eyes. I promised never to steal again. He let me out of the gate, and I rushed off home, thrilled with excitement. I almost burst the door open and, rushing up to my mother, shouted, "I've seen God. He's such a kind old man. He's given me a penny." Sometimes now I think that God is dead, that he has died of sheer loneliness and grief over the sad lot of his lost children. I have often wondered what I have lost through embracing scalawagism with its visionary splendors. Probably, were it not for that, I should be the proud possessor of a brick house in a decorous suburb, and vast ambition, wear a white collar and cuffs, and, who knows, be pushing my lawnmower, hiding my sarcastic grin over its ostentatious hummus. I watch my envious neighbor cut his grass with shears. Even so, I think the greater prize is in being able to sit over the hearth fire or the campfire with one's comrades, reveling in the realism of the not permissible, turning the universe the other way and singing the reminiscent vagabonds, excelsior onward to the past. Ever back to some happy past, back to the miser hordes from the glorious past, to the loaded wine cellars of dreamland's infinity, to uncork the bottled dead sunsets, foaming champagnes of forgotten forest moonlights and blazing campfires, bubbling laughter and friendly eyes. Drink deeply to her lips of other days. Renew the old vows, clasp her tightly, gaze in her eyes ere the desert wind blow her from your arms as scattered dust. And, if she be old, if her face, her loveliness, be changed to the wrinkled map, the sad parchment whereon time's hand ever toils to write creation's grief, kiss her passionately. Dip her in the bath of old cleansing imagination, re-whiten her limbs and make her beautiful. Watch her happiness. Make the only future man ever knew, or ever will know, gladden and become rich with life's old wine of the beautifully unreal. Friend, shut your eyes and look at the past. See sunsets and sunrises, the mirrored blue days of silent skies, soaring birds, ancient cities, nations and their histories, empires of splendid chaotic violence, laughter, love and intense tragical drama. Now shut your eyes and look at the future. Can you see one moment of its reality? No, you cannot. So make your spiritual creed some dim long ago remembrance of your own happiness, and cherish and make the old the new. Make yesterday and today and tomorrow shining planets that came and are coming from the illimitable past to swim into the happy skies of your ken. And let the lawnmower's triumphant, respectable humming go by. Probably we vagabonds are mad, and the great majority who laugh at sentiment are the really sane ones. How strange indeed if, after all, the poets are wrong, and the great and glorious aim and end of the universe is affluence, with flabbiness, grand pianofortes, Brussels carpets, retinues of wooden servants, and gold. Gold. Indeed, for all those things we vagabonds must hold the candle to the devil. For alas, the body cannot live on sunsets, and the memory of sad derelicts, dead sailors and forgotten heroes. But mentally we are wealthy. We have explored the gold fields of the universe and struck a rich vein. It is rough gold, truly, but perhaps our Creator never meant it to be reforged and re-hallmarked after He scattered it among the stars. Certainly it has always appealed to me in the rough state, more so than in the polish of strange, unmusical voices, high collars and a great lack of appreciation for shabby men. We vagabonds are not conscientious judges of worldly greatness. We are strangely biased in favor of those lost outcasts who drift on the waters of infinity, singing shanties to the wandering stars, and not caring so long as God's in His heaven all's right with the world. What matters if men are happy? Yes, even though they fall by the roadside and die, with no obituary notice in the cause of little Crepe, as one of my critics said. He and I think, would tramp the world together, if we had a chance to live our life over again. We may live again. I sometimes think I have lived before. And what greater truth is there in the hearts of men than their own belief in all that they believe? Dear audience, this chapter reminds us that a wandering life is not only about distance, but about depth. The Maori elders, the bushfaller, the shy girl by the lake, the children who ran to a violin melody, each offered the same lesson in different clothes. Carry curiosity like a compass. Treat every culture and person with dignity. Let art or a simple craft be your faithful companion when money and certainty run thin. Share what you have and accept help with grace. Listen more than you speak, because every voice holds a map you do not yet know. If you are tired, rest under your own version of the carry trees. If you feel lost, play your small song anyway. If the road grows cold, warm it with kindness. Keep a little coin for rainy days, and a larger reserve of hope for clear ones. And when beauty appears in ordinary places, pause and look twice. The journey gets lighter when we walk with gratitude. Dreaming over New Zealand days and the many types and characters I have met destroys the continuity of actual events. My thoughts digress for a moment to various experiences and pictures which my memory has recorded. Memories, in the perspective of dead time, vary with our moods. Sometimes the figures and events stand out vividly, and at other times are elusive, and seem some sad, intangible thing far away in the background of life. The old bushman's red beard and twinkling eyes, the squatting savages by their huts, the sensitive mouths and wondering eyes of the native girls, old scalawags beach. The noise of sailors on ships in the bay, Horncastle's jovial face aglow with joy and drink. The palm-clad shores, and Apia's primitive town, seem far-off dreams. I can still see Robert Louis Stevenson in Samoa. His tall, bony form, attired in white trousers, shirt and old shoes only, stands on the beach. His hand is arched over his watching eyes. His loose scarf blows out behind him to the gusty trade wind, as he stares seaward at the fading schooner that takes some friend away forever. He looks like some memorial figure, the statue of a half-poet, half-pioneer, gazing with aching eyes across the sea. The wind stirs the wisp of dark hair on the high pale brow. The head is hatless and perfectly still, but the fine eyes are alive and full of faraway thoughts. Now he moves away and goes up the shore, and does not even see the smile of recognition on the face of the trading ship's skipper, who passes with a Samoan sailor and one other. Like the memory of some tragical living picture, it all flashes across my mind. I could think it all unreal, some far-off rocky, beautiful unknown, all set in the seas of my imagination, as I paint the stars, the skies, the breaking waves. The ships and the sailors coming into the harbor, or once more going seaward. At other times, Samoa's isles come back vividly, and just as a sailor, far away at sea, stands on the forecastle head and watches the big clouds shift on the horizon as they break and suddenly reveal blue tropical skies over the outstretched, unknown continents, shores of singing waves and palm forests. So I see the past, and the figures move. The winds stir the trees, and the magical, musical voices of savage men and women sing and laugh, in a world that is now the Arabian Nights entertainments of my boyhood. As you can imagine, I have met many strange types of men and women in my travels, types both good and bad. I tramped many weary miles in the Australian bush when I was 15 years of age. Often, I tramped alone when I could not get a congenial comrade. I was sometimes very lucky, and my reminiscences of those good comrades are the lights that shine down the dark tracks, far away as I remember their eyes. One was a man of about 30 years of age. He was exceedingly cheerful and full of song and devilment. I can still see his refined face aglow as he sits under the scorched gum trees, smashing swamp mosquitoes on his hand, or singing his favorite songs in a quiet, manly voice. We stayed together for 2 or 3 days at a sheep station, where the boss was a German. He was all right. But there were 2 German women and a son there too. When I played the violin to them, and turned around for the welcome and expected applause, they said, "Vel dat vash, little nice," and then they shook their Teutonic square heads, and, with their eyes and hands lifted to the shanty roof, said, "But ois, you should hear them play the tunes in Germany." Then my boyish blood warmed up and I said, "Germans can't play the violin. Paganini wasn't a German. No German ever played except by science. Mein Gott, oh halves, you never vash herds, Vons Kriesberg." He played that same tunes which you just now play, Sofu. Here they shrugged their shoulders with disgust at my performance, like Dis and the 2 German women, who had faces like pasty pumpkins with glass eyes stuck in them, and the son, with his big mustache twirled at the ends, lifted their hands and eyes to the roof to express the ecstatic memory of the German's violin playing. Their mouths went emitting a strange sound that faded away in complete exhaustion as they sank down onto the 3 chairs, like 3 puppets. Not only violin playing, but everything, was wonderful in German art. If one said, "What a nice picture," or "What nice butter," they'd raise their eyebrows and sigh out that old crescendo, and say, "Have yous never tasted German butter?" It was the same with eggs, beef, pork, men, boots, girls, or any DD thing. My congenial comrade went off to New Zealand, and I ran across another one, who was most uncongenial for a time. We were tramping across the bushlands, looking for work on stations and secretly hoping that we were not wanted. My friend was a short, thick-set, thick-necked fellow, about 2 years older than I, with a slightly elevated, protruding chin and a mouth that talked from morn till night about his ancestry. I forget now whether he said they were descendants of Julius Caesar's invading horde, or of William the Conqueror. Anyway, our friendship was one incessant argument. I was just on 6 feet high, full of health and independent strength, and I found that I was supposed to walk beside him with my head hanging for shame, because I was only a common Englishman. We're on a lonely bush track. Ragged gum trees fenced the broken skylines for miles and miles around us. The only onlookers were parrots and cockatoos, like vividly colored leaves overhead. There was no sight or sound of human habitation in that vast, somber solitude as we tramped along together. A feeling of grim exultation seemed to suddenly seize me. Once more I swallowed another pill of insult, and I looked down sideways at my blue-blooded companion. I thought of my ancestral forefathers, and wondered if his ancestors had robbed my ancestors, and ravaged their lands and castles, my possible birthright. He did not know what I was thinking of as he talked away. His short legs strutted along the track with the toes turned up. His nose and chin also inclined skyward, as once more he reminded me of my plebeian origin. Suddenly, well, I'll not tell you all, for why should we be proud of the animalistic strain that sometimes dominates our natures? Why be proud that suddenly a bolt seemed to fall from the blue, and one of the reputed descendants of the first Kaiser Bill got his deserts, and lay with his back in the dust, his imperial nose and semi-conscious eyes staring half-vacantly up at the Australian sky, while plebeian old pioneer England, with a swag on his back, tramped away and faded on the horizon triumphant. Ere sunset darkened the sky, I lay ambushed in a clump of wattles by the forest, then peeped and saw my comrade coming slowly down the track with his toes turned down. I repented and thought, even if it's true, he cannot help being the descendant of bloodthirsty ravishers, who killed old men and robbed my country's churches. No, even he cannot help himself. So I crept out and told him I repented, and once more we tramped along as comrades. So silent was he about William the Conqueror, that you would have thought such a man had never lived. He admitted that night, as we sat by the campfire, when I had explained my feelings to him, that his descent was only a family rumor. Hearing that, I truly forgave him, and we lifted the billy can of cold tea and drank a united toast to the memory of Caractacus and Odyssey, and death to all descendants of the first great bloated Kaiser Bill who dare prove to us their murderous, cowardly ancestry. I met yet another gentleman of ancient emigrant blood in Tahiti. He was a gigantic old chap, the chief. I slept in his hut with 4 American runaway sailors, who were waiting with me for the next boat to call, so that we could clear out. Night after night, that old chief would sit and tell us of the wonderful earlier days, when he was the great king of the inland dominions, loved by all the tribes for his bravery and justice, and had had a special envoy sent out by Queen Victoria to represent her appreciation to the one true Christian monarch of the southern seas. He had fine eyes, and they flashed as he told of these old days, and his tattooed frame swelled majestically over many a wild memory. He even shed tears as he sang to us old furrow songs of dead heroes, mighty chiefs and tender maids he had eaten at the cannibalistic festive board. One night we returned to the hut and found that the great monarch had bolted off with all our possessions. Even my last shirt had gone. 2 weeks later, he was caught by the gendarmes. Then we heard that he was a ferocious cannibal of low origin, and that they had been trying to catch him for 12 months. He had killed a native boy, strangled him in the forest, and eaten him. Before we left, we heard that he had been shot by the French commissioners. About 6 weeks after, while I was walking along the beach at Apia, I met him. He ran for his life, before my friend and I got a chance to recover from our astonishment and run in the opposite direction. The hired native sharpshooters had deliberately missed him, and the old scoundrel had fallen dead till nightfall only. Another time I met an old dilapidated sundowner, a real specimen of the Australian bush. It was miles up country where I first met him, sitting under his gum trees by a creek making his billy boil. He gave me a hot drink and I gave him a tobacco plug. And as the billy boiled up again, he said, "Where you're bound for?" "Anywhere," I answered. "Well, you'd better come with me to Kumaranta Creek, 10 miles off the western track, by Wangaris Yards. We can get plenty tucker there, and then on to the sandy hills and across Dead Girl's Flat, into Humpy Bomb, that leads across Gum Creek into Dead Crow's Paddock, 2 miles or more from Dead Man's Hollow." Then strike the Ghoulies by Riley's ranch, and there we can get another stock of Tucker. He's a real alright Unriley is, and not too bad either. And so he rambled on, as he wiped his grizzly gray beard, a beard so thick with spittle and tobacco juice, that it acted as a kind of flexure for him. The buzzing insects flapped their wings and struggled with their tangled feet in that awful hairy web, till they were swept into eternity by his brushing hand. Indeed, his companionship was greatly esteemed by me, for as we tramped along under the sweltering sun, I walked beside him untormented by the mosquitoes and the myriads of hissing flies that like a swarm of honeybees kept on his side, following his monstrous bushy beard as we traveled south. His whole life was centered on the various stations by the known tracks and the grades of generosity in the hearts of the overseers and stockmen. These sundowners arrive at the stations at sunset and appeal for work, just as the day's work is finished, and bolt off at daybreak into the bush, with their old brown blanket on their backs. Stolid old men, some of them. They are real derelicts of the old days. They look like gray-bearded figureheads of ships, fixed on weary, ragged bodies. As with their pipes in their mouths they pass and fade across the oceans of scrub, spinifex and sand. Buccaneers on the high seas of Australian bush. My old sundowner hardly ever spoke as we wandered along under the gum trees, as the magpies sat on the twigs and chuckled, and bees moaned in the bush flowers of the hollows. We arrived in a bush town of about 20 wooden houses and 2 shops that sold all humanity requires. I played the violin, and he was delighted when I gave him all the money which he collected in his vast broad-rimmed hat. "I say, matey, chum up with me," he said. As his long sleeping commercial, I opened and stared at the money. But I didn't chum up with him. I was not built for a sun. I recall how he always said his prayers after he had tucked his blanket around his body and laid his head on the heaped bush grass. He was old then. I suppose he's long been dead now, and lies somewhere in those faraway bushes. I've seen some strange types in my time. But what are those types compared to the normal tribes I've seen and played to, laughed, loved, and squabbled with? Little brown children clothed only in moonlight and sunlight, singing cheerfully by the South Sea breakers under the dark-fingered cocoa palm. Sad little faces, some like deserted baby angels, looking up into my face, my children. Disheveled, strange old bush mothers, crooning to their buds of humanity, tiny brown clinging hands and moving mouths at their kind, softly feeding brown breasts, my mothers. Old tattooed chiefs and grim-looking kings, rough-haired semi-savage girls, and youths jabbering in strange tongues, with hushed, secret voices, over the terrible white plague that had entered and stricken their primitive city of huts, the white-faced, fierce-looking invaders from across the seas, ravishers of their maidens. The scum of the western cities, prowling about the villages that had become the hotbeds of lust and sin's terrible paradise. Missionaries, with melancholy, hollow voices, who seldom knew anything of the intense inner life of humanity and the great philosophy of happiness. Superstitious, bigoted old chiefs, cursing the white man's Bible. Philosophical old brown men with high brows and keen dark eyes, reflectively nodding their heads. South Sea Oldenburgs, striving to convince grim South Sea stalwart, dark, tattooed Schopenhauers, shouting about windbag. I can see again the ironical heathen chief sitting by his palatial hut. He is clever, a Voltaire of the southern seas. His strong face is tattooed, grim-looking are his little eyes, as he grins and looks at the Marquesan Kotov arms, which he has invented and placed at his door, a large empty rum barrel, and on top of it a Christian Bible. I see the pretty Samoan girl Milanku, with lovely dreaming eyes and thick bronzed hair, with a red and white hibiscus flower stuck in at each side. Her brown limbs and figure are the perfection of graceful beauty, dressed only in a little blue chemise. She eloped with a noble white man to the Gilbert Isles, and committed suicide when he left her, ere her firstborn could creep to her bosom and taste the only milk of human kindness it would most probably have ever known. Earnest-faced Tippo, her sister, sits on the slope, happy as night with its stars as she, with 6 little dark, plump children with demon-like eyes romping all round her. She has married an uncivilized nigger from Timbuktu. Oh, happy girl! How the natives chided and sneered at her at first, for not marrying a great white lord as her sister did. Beautiful women, and men also, I have met in strange places. I have found them in the hovels and among the scum of life, and sometimes in the palatial home of affluence. Convicts of New Caledonia in the calaboose, or toiling in chains, breathing, yet as dead as dust, with hollow sad eyes, corpses from La Belle France, my poor brothers. Old men and women begging by the curbside in the faraway civilized isle of the western seas. The old man in rags, a skeleton on tottering feet, shivering, going down the cold windy main road of the lighted suburb, singing, with a palsied old mouth, some song that God composed ere Christ came. He is my beloved comrade, bury me with him, so that the flowers over us may twine in our dead dust, and find mutual sympathy. I have seen multitudes of commercial burglars, wealthy villains, who fought so valiantly to save their own lives, that they have received the commercial VC for valor, and penniless. Profligate angels, fighting side by side in the battle of nations, that battle wherein the bullets cause mortal wounds, though many years pass before they send the bloodless corpses to heaven or hell. I have seen old, ragged, hideous long-dead women still sitting by the attic's hearth fire, sipping the gin bottle sweet-fumed opium for their spectral dreams. As they stare at the embers burning in the red glow, they see their own girlhood faces smile once more back into their bleared eyes, with remembered beauty, happiness, and glorious faith. Old ruse to dream somewhere, the men who made the vows to those drunken old women and never kept them may. They sleep well, but never wake. I have heard the majestic cathedral organ thunder, its rolling music to the roof as the beggar passed by the massive nail-studded door on swollen feet, rubbed his cold skeleton hands together, and spat viciously. No food in his body, and his soul well. Why should he worry about his soul? I have seen the great shocked multitude open their eyes aghast, and heard the tremendous crash, the clatter of the hail of stones, when the voice said, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." Oh wonderful goodness! Oh icy, stony virtue! Ah! Not only in the wild Australasian bush or in the southern seas is the great drama of life enacted, the great drama that makes your heart cold, and the old warm belief become encrusted with icicles, as you dream over the strange lot of the wandering, lost children. I've laid me down deep in the bush to sleep, and wrapped my body in the sunset's blaze, then wondered why he made sad wings for days, to fly away on all our world to weep, like to a myriad birds blown round sunset. In song, I thought I watched God's careworn face, brushed by bright wings the unborn human race, who did not want their mortal birth just yet. I heard the growing flowers cry in the night, and trees that whisper of old cherished things, and still the startled, hurried rush of wings. It was the stars sighed out upon their flight. O troubadours, O stars, what sing you of? O wandering minstrels, is it to God's plan you sing, or to the exiled heart of man, who pays with death's blind eyes and cherished love? But still, the children cry upon the plain, beside a grave, and still the cheerful king grows fat, and sad old men say, anything, oh God, except to live this life again. Before I left New Zealand, I secured an engagement to play the violin at a concert hall where the district assembled to applaud the talent of youthful pianoforte players and maidens who had cultivated voices. I was engaged to play violin solos, accompanied by the piano, and to perform suitable tripping melodies for old feet when the parents danced after the entertainment. One night, when I was hurrying back to my rooms after the dance, sick at heart for, believe me, I do not tell you of my many aspirations and the disappointments of those days, I heard a wheezy voice behind me call, "Hi, you, Mr. Violinist." I immediately turned, and an old gentleman with a benevolent, cheerful face stood puffing and smiling at me. "Pray excuse my interruption," he said as he bowed. Then he continued, "Ah, my dear boy, you are a real musician and play your instrument as though you have a soul. You remind me of my own youthful days, when I played the violin, by special command, to Queen Victoria." Hearing this, I at once became inwardly attentive. I had several manuscript songs that I wanted to get published, and no publisher in New Zealand or Australia would look at them unless I paid for the expense of engraving. So, not knowing what influence the old fellow might have, I speedily got into conversation with him, not from ambitious motives only, for he seemed a kind-hearted and intellectual old man, and therefore commanded my respect as well as my hopes. Inviting me into an hotel, he offered me a drink, and seemed very much surprised when I asked for shandy gaff, which is a mixture of ginger beer and light ale. I flushed slightly and reordered whiskey at his suggestion, and, though it tasted like kava and paraffin oil mixed, I bravely took sips of it, while the old chap told me of his violin engagements and the praise accorded him by the musical critic of the times, and by personages in the royal courts of Europe. As I listened and nodded approval and surprise, I observed him carefully. He was innocent looking, with a cheery round face, and eyes that were small, but vivacious and blue. His hat was neither a tall hat nor a bowler. It had a small rim, which gave it that clerical contour which seems to be worn especially to allay any suspicion that might fall on its owner. I would not reflect upon the appearance of this gentleman so much, if it were not that his appearance helped him enormously. I am not going to be hard upon him either. Notwithstanding his sins, he was at heart a kindly man. But nature had mixed his dough with too much yeast, so that his aspirations to do well rose far beyond the range of his intellect and solid commercial honesty. This was a fact that helped me considerably, for this commonplace failing of our race, shown in him, put me on my guard in the future and saved me much pain and many misfortunes in after days. I do not mean to be sarcastic in the foregoing remarks, though it may sound like it. I only intend to convey to those who have not experienced much the fact that all individual types of good and bad men you meet in civilized lands are just teachers in the university, that you must face, if you are not blessed with wealth, and go off to seek it. They give you experience, and make you a critic of your race, so that you can know and appreciate goodness, if in your lifetime you are fortunate enough to meet it. They also teach you to be lenient in your judgment of others, and by comparisons and pondering over their sins, you will recognize your own. Though the old fellow tried to impress me with his greatness, and praised my many virtues, I instinctively felt that I did not possess them. I also noticed that, though he told me that he had just arrived at Christchurch to give lectures to increase the funds for orphanage children, his fancy waistcoat had been brushed to death and looked shabby. This fact damped both my hopes and vanity, for I perceived that his praise of my violin playing was inspired by very much the same feeling that made me repeatedly nod polite approval over his erstwhile fame in the royal courts and concerts of Great Britain. In short, we were both hard up for something that we needed, and saw that we could help each other by being polite and awaiting events. I was young, and he was gray and old, and possibly had been a really good man in his day, till the soulful melody of heartbeats, called life, had gradually resolved itself into a minor key. And that drama of gray hairs and a wheezy voice that praised my youthful melodies in that saloon bar off the main road in Christchurch, New Zealand. He fingered about in his pocket, and I at once ordered him another drink, and inspired with bravery, through his shabby waistcoat, I boldly called for shandy gaff and pushed the whiskey aside. We were now, by observation of each other's deficiencies, brothers, and though Queen Victoria's praise of his talent still lingered in my memory, I noticed that he gave a sigh of relief as I paid for the next drink, and at once I felt that we were at last equals. I will not weary you with any more details, but on the way home that night he walked beside me, and I agreed to be the solo violinist at the lectures which he was about to give in various halls that he was hiring. I was not to get a specified salary, but was to receive, which was better still, he said, shares in the collection and in the tickets sold, after the bulk of the proceeds had been put by for the New Zealand orphanages. Next morning he called at my rooms at the time appointed. By daylight my clothes did not look as affluent as they did by gaslight. In a moment he noticed this and without any overture said, "Put your hat on, my boy, and come to my tailor's and get fitted out." I was astonished to hear him say this, and, not thinking my prospective abilities in his service might deserve such kindness, my best instincts got the momentary upper hand of those inclinations which are usually the strongest in men who have endeavored to earn their livelihood by musical accomplishments. So I at first demurred, and then, overjoyed, went with him to his tailor, who lived not a half-mile off. He even bought me endurable cuffs, and the day before the first lecture came off, I looked as well dressed as anyone in the district. On the morning before the first lecture at the suburban hall, I strolled down the main road and to my astonishment saw my name in large type on big white bills. If I remember right, this is how the advertisement went. Signor Sofroni, the celebrated Italian violin virtuoso, has kindly consented to perform at the Orphanage Fund lectures. And then followed an account of the lecturer's philanthropic and stirring speeches on behalf of helpless children. At first I felt annoyed at this being done without my permission, for I had a kind of suspicion that the old lecturer thought more of himself than of the orphan children, and I did not want to be mixed up with anything that was likely to look shady, both for my own self-respect and my youthful principles. I at once sought my new employer and told him, as delicately as possible, that I did not care to be billed as a celebrated violinist from Italy, and, moreover, not so very far off, was the very place where I had been playing. "My dear, dear boy," he said, opening his eyes as though with amazement. "You call yourself a violin player, and are afraid to be billed. You must be mad." "Well," I answered, considerably mollified by the force of his arguments. "Your bill says, 'The Right Honorable S. Middleton will take the chair.' How can I be both? And I know nothing about taking chairs either. Leave it all to me. All you've got to do is to play the violin and make money," he said. And I went off, feeling a little guilty of ingratitude. For I certainly had a good suit of clothes on, and my expectations financially seemed very good. Before the concert night, my employer canvassed the streets, and indeed the whole district, and sold some hundreds of tickets. Girls even stood at the mission rooms and church doors and sold his tickets. They were given special permission by the clergy, because of the noble cause which my employer lectured upon. When I arrived at the hall at the opening hour, I saw a vast crowd waiting by the door. The old lecturer was with me and rubbed his hands as we went round to the back entrance to prepare for the concert. His personality was of the masterful kind, but, mustering up my courage, I at last said to him, "Shall I have to take the chair and make a speech?" For I was still a little suspicious of my dual personality as an Italian violin virtuoso and the Right Honorable S. Middleton. To my intense relief, he patted me on the back and said, "Play the violin as well as you are able, and I will do all the rest." My feelings were relieved, and the thought of how much I should get from the shares of tickets sold cheered me up considerably. Before I proceed, I may as well tell you that though he professed to lecture for the benefit of little children, and was deeply religious, for he prayed so fervently before meals that I also prayed, out of sheer respect for his religious earnestness, as far as I knew, he never paid 1 cent to any fund. Neither did he pay for the halls that he hired, nor for the printing of his preposterous bills, nor for anything that became his. There was a special dressing room in this hall. It was like a box, and just at the side of the stage door. When the old lecturer was ready, he gave the little doorboy 2pence, and told him to open the entrance to the hall and let the crowd in at the front, while the professor at the back groomed himself before his little pocket mirror and I combed my hair. My heart began to beat a little faster than usual, for I heard the audience starting to stamp and cheer with impatience, just behind the small door in front of me. The old rogue said hastily, "Go in and take the chair, and I will walk in behind you." "Perhaps you had better go first," I said, and stepped aside. "No, no," he responded quickly, in his masterful voice, and not wishing to appear nervous the first night, I took a bold plunge and suddenly appeared before the vast crowd of bronzed faces that made up that New Zealand audience. Had it been an ordinary solo engagement, I should have had something to do, and so have been completely at my ease. But when the vast crowd rose in a body and cheered me, thinking that I had appeared first to make a preliminary speech, ere the great philanthropist lectured about cruelty to orphan children, and all the other lies on his bill, I felt very ill at ease, and could only bow repeatedly and gaze at the little door, hoping my employer would step on the stage. He did not appear, and I think I must have bowed several times after the last clapping hand had ceased among the smiling ladies in the front seats, who were gazing upon me with evident approval. And at last, bewildered, I stooped to open my violin case. I was about to let the lecture go to the winds and start a solo, when suddenly the door opened at the side of me and the professor stood bowing to the audience. They rose en masse and cheered him. As I nearly tumbled over my violin and sat in the little chair which was the only furniture of the platform, I felt like one in a dream as I sat there twirling my fingers, watching the old fellow as his arms swayed and lifted with his gray head toward the ceiling. And in fervent tones, he told the audience that the Right Honorable S. Middleton had been suddenly taken ill, and that I had kindly consented to take the chair, as well as perform solos on the violin. I have found out since that this ruse is a commonplace excuse for a one-man lecture and entertainment. It saves expenses, and is practiced at lectures and concerts throughout the world. He was really a clever professional liar, and the way he held his arms aloft and passionately pleaded for the helpless children touched the audience as though it throbbed with one large heart. It is a memory that I think would make the most credulous nature become skeptical when listening to shabbily dressed men who appeal for charity beyond their own immediate requirements. Though he had bought me a new soutane credit, I found out afterwards he did not trouble much about his own clothes, but depended on the pathos of his voice and his gray hairs. I felt suspicious of the genuineness of his orphanage appeals, but as I sat there listening to him, a sense of intense shame came over me, for I, as well as the whole audience, was touched by the pathos of his phrases and the descriptive figures, which he gave of poor little starving orphans that had appealed for bread. Then, with his hands lifted to the ceiling, he held the whole crowd spellbound as he described a dying child's last look and words in a London workhouse. As he finished, a great sigh echoed through the hall, as though it was one sound from 1,000 hearts that were bursting with emotion. His voice ceased and he turned to me, and as I lifted the glass of water to his lips, I noticed that he had tears in his eyes, for his imagination had carried him out of himself and touched him as well as me. Then I stood up and played a solo, after which I extemporized an accompaniment to a sacred song which he sang. For though he was old and sinful, his voice was mellow and sweet. He told me he was the last living member of the old Christy minstrels of London, and from his manner and general conversation, I still believe that assertion of his was a true one. I asked him once to play the violin, but he would not do so, though he could play the banjo well. I have never been so cheered by an audience as I was that night. I was called and recalled. I do not believe it was so much for my playing, or for the opinion of Italian royalty and the Queen of England on my wonderful playing. It was on the programme as for my being thought a friend of that old lecturer on dying orphan children. For before we played the national anthem, he told them that I had consented to go with him through New Zealand and play solos purely for the sake of helping unhappy children, and that I was to receive no salary. I did not know how true it was when he said that, but I often think how fortunate I was not to have been arrested with him, for, though I was quite innocent, I believe that we were both liable to penal servitude for giving those charitable concerts. Before the audience dispersed, the lecturer made an extra collection, notwithstanding the fact that each member of the audience had paid 1 or 2 shillings for admittance, and given 6pence for a program. At the hall door, after all was over, he interviewed many of the ladies who sought a personal introduction. We also received many invitations to call at their homes, and my old employer seemed quite touched by the many sympathetic phrases they poured in his ears. When we were alone, he stood under a lamppost and counted out the collection, and though I lounged by him and gave many hints, he did not offer me a portion, so I asked him for my share straight out. He had promised me some money just before the lecture. "I dare not give it to you," he said. "I must first pay for the hall, the printing and the amount due to the orphanage. Then, rest assured, my boy, you shall get your share." Next day he got fearfully drunk, and I became convinced that he was not genuine, though the night before I had left him thinking that I must be mistaken in my suspicions. The very boldness of his bills and his plans would have disarmed older men, and I was then only about 21 years of age. I had given my other job up, and so, for the time being, I was compelled to stick to him. He rebuked me for not saying grace before my meals, and I discovered that he really was religious in the common sense of the term. We even had arguments together because I would not agree with all he said. He was extremely happy and sang to himself all day, rose at 5 o'clock every morning and splashed water all over the room as he washed. While I complained and begged for another hour's rest, I felt envious and yet sorry for him, and myself too. When a man dimly realizes his objectness in the flesh, he has begun to realize his divinity. The night of his mind, that was dark, becomes unclouded, and the stars glimmer forth only to sadden him. He does not feel any longer so ready to criticize the dark of his neighbor's mind, which is still happy in that night of intellectual blindness, which is such a blessing to men who inherit the heavens through an acute squint. My swindling old employer rejoiced in this squint to an abnormal degree. He really did believe that he was a pious and good-living man. When I refused to work for him, and told him he was a rogue, he was so shocked that I even relented a little, and took his proffered hand when I said goodbye. He seemed to value my opinions, though he did not agree with them, and I honestly believe that, had he not had his religious aspirations to fall back upon, he would have fallen back upon himself and been a really good man. When he left the district, his creditors came down on me, and I had a lot of trouble to prevent myself being arrested. The tailor who had supplied my suit of clothes stopped me in the street. I lost my temper, and we nearly came to blows, and I was almost locked up. Next morning I called upon the tailor and told him the truth. He apologized for his remarks and refused to take more than half the money due for the clothes, which I paid him. I never saw the lecturer on orphanages again, and as it was years ago, and he was old then, I feel that he must have given his last lecture, closed his stage door forever, and gone away. Dear audience, the road through these pages teaches a simple, sturdy wisdom. Memories shift, people are complicated. Beauty and danger often camp side by side. Be open-hearted, but carry good boundaries. Give help, not your whole pack. Travel light in pride and heavy in humility. Listen before judging. Cultures you don't understand are not yours to fix. Forgive quickly, but remember clearly, so charm can't swindle you twice. Keep one craft that steadies you, a violin, a notebook, a prayer, because art turns hunger and dust into meaning. Choose comrades by their quiet kindness, not their grand stories. When you fall, get up with curiosity, not bitterness. The map is drawn by walkers, not worriers. And hold on to Wonder Moon on a Lake, a child's song, the way strangers become teachers at a campfire. A small challenge for the week: do one courageous kindness, set one honest boundary, and take 1 minute to notice something beautiful. If you can do those 3, you are already winning the long journey. About this time, I became homesick and tried to find a berth on one of the homebound boats. I eventually secured a job on a tramp steamer. The SSP there was nothing exceptional on the trip except the monotony of the ship's routine. We called at Hobart, Tasmania, and after experiencing stiflingly hot weather, crossing the Indian Ocean, eventually arrived at Colombo. The natives came clambering on board and attempted to take possession of all our portable property. They are a dark mahogany-colored people, a cheerful-looking folk. All their actions seem to be guided by a strong commercial instinct. Loaded with bunches of bananas and baskets of oranges and limes, they ran about the decks, bargaining for old shirts and cast-off clothing. Over the vessel's side floated their outrigger catamarans, swarming with dark, almost nude men and women. Swimming in the sea were their children, shouting, "I dive, I dive," as they looked up to the passengers on deck, who threw pennies into the sea. As the coin reached the water, down went their heads and up their legs, as like frogs they all dived down into the depths in a mad race to secure the coveted coin, which is never lost. At the moment when it seems impossible for them to live so long under the water, the calm surface of the sea trembles at the spot where the coin was thrown. In and up come a score of frizzly heads from the ocean's depth, and the winner holds the prize between his teeth. About a week or so after leaving Colombo, we entered the Suez Canal. It was night. As the boats enter the canal, a searchlight is fixed onto the forecastle head to illumine the narrow waterway that flows 90 miles across the desert. It must be an impressive sight from the desert, the steamer going across like some mammoth beast, with a monster eye in front, and the portholes pulsing light in the iron sides as the steamer moves along. I remember one incident that happened before we passed the canal that night. I was standing by the starboard alleyway dreaming and watching the stars glittering over the desert as the engines took the steamer along at about 4 knots an hour, when a rustling noise behind some barrels startled me. It was quite dark, and the decks were silent, for most of the passengers were asleep. Wondering what on earth could be stirring in the gloom, I leaned forward and saw 2 bright eyes looking out between some casks, and a soft voice crying out said something to me in a language which I did not understand. It was a pretty little Arab maid, a stowaway, who had crept on board at Ismailia, where we had stopped for 1 hour. I lifted her up tenderly. She was as black-skinned as night and only wore a tiny loincloth. She raised her bright eyes and was crying, but I took her along the alleyway and down below, and by kindness reassured her. We gave her a good feed, and then, tired out, she fell asleep in my bunk, and I slept on the sea chests in the cabin. In the morning she danced to us in our berth and caused us great merriment. We sneaked her ashore at Port Said, where she had friends. She had stowed away so as to reach them. We gave her plenty of food to take off with her, and we were sorry to see her go. She was only about 7 years old. 3 weeks after leaving Port Said, we arrived in England and berthed at Tilbury Docks. The atmosphere of primeval lands, shining under tropic suns and glorious stars, faded to a far-off dream as the dull drab gray of English skies drenched the wharves and the shouting dock laborers. As the days wore on, once again the roaming fever turned my thoughts to the sea. With all the splendor of its grand uncertainty, its devilish irony and vicissitude, though the glamour of romance had faded, yet my wanderings and turbulent experiences had completely unsettled me. Indeed, they had unfitted me for the humdrum commercial existence which I should have had to follow had I made up my mind to settle in my own country, assume respectability, and hide, as beneath a cloak, my inherent vagabond nature. The feathered quill pen at the desk would have fluttered to fly, held by my sympathetic hand. The old wandering fever still gripped me. I was always wanting to be off into the uncertainty, to be buffing round the capes of unknown seas, exploring for the marvelous unexpected, standing on the decks of imagination, under the flying moonlit sails of glorious illusion, singing wild mad shanties over wonderful argosies of schemes that could never be realized. Yes, to be ashore on some faraway isle, clasping the savage maid in your arms by the coquelicots, gazing in the delicious orbs of the universe infinity in beams of island. To breathe the present, yet be alive in the past, far away down the centuries of the modern dark ages. To walk by primeval forest and tumbling moonlit seas, where they break over coral reefs. To rest by campfires and huts, talking with bushwomen and men, and girls with sparkling eyes, eyes clear as heaven with her moon and stars. To be back in the splendid aboriginal darkness as it was in the beginning. Yet alas, as I dream, the faint, immodest blush of dawn tints the distant skyline. It is the birth of grief and beauty. Awakening sunrise is a gleam in her warm eyes. Her sandals are dipped in fire, and the stars are in her hair. Onward she creeps, in the beauty of her maiden nakedness, cloaked in glorious unreal tinsel and grief. Blushing like a goddess, she comes treading the sky, the glorious, wonderful harlots of old. It was a great day when I next found myself outbound, going down channel on a tramp steamer for the Canary Isles and Sierra Leone. I had often wished to go to West Africa, and so, when the opportunity came, I did not hesitate. I will not dwell at any length on the events that preceded my arrival on the West Coast, but will briefly give my impression of things as they appeared to me in those days. You cannot, however imaginative you may be, imagine you are elsewhere than on the Gold Coast. The atmosphere of the moist jungle, the barbarian hubbub of excited native voices, the beating of the tom-toms in the far-off villages, the toiling natives, driven by the loud-voiced white overseer of the gold mines, continually remind you that you are in the barbarian paradise of Unchanged. For miles and miles the primeval jungle stretches, and standing on the hilltops you can see the far-off native huts looking like groups of pegtops against the sunset. On the higher slopes, by the gold mines, stand the bungalows of the white men. They are comfortable inside and well furnished, sheltered from the blazing sunlight by mahogany and palm trees. The white men who are employed on the mines loaf about near them, and the Gold Coast natives supply their wants. For a brass ring, or a piece of sham jewelry, they can purchase native labor, and for a pound or so buy dusky female slaves, whom they call mammies. Virtue is not the most prominent characteristic of Gold Coast natives. As the white men sit in those bungalows by night, they can hear the native drums beating far away, and watch the lizards and scorpions slipping across the moonlight of their bedroom walls, and, maybe, hear their comrade in the next bungalow raving in the delirium of fever. Malaria, blackwater fever, and other things often end the exile's career. At night, the living can dream and think of home, and watch from their bungalow doors the little white stones and crosses glimmering in the African moonlight in the hollows where the homesick dead white men lie asleep. Though the gold mines lay all round, gold was not the essential requirement. A bottle of English beer, placed on a post by a bungalow or graveyard, would make a dead white man sit up and grasp it. Missionaries had been on the Gold Coast for years trying to reform the natives, who many of them had embraced Christianity. They often asked us mysterious questions about the white man's land, as though they were puzzled and could not fathom the meaning of it all. They had a faint idea that England was a land of some beautiful golden age, where sin was unknown. Otherwise, why did the white men come across the seas to preach to them when the natives were so contented with their lot and wished the missionaries to hell? So spoke King Lobeng. He was a powerful fellow, and when he walked, looked very majestic, as he trailed his heavy blanket behind him. He lived in a palatial kraal and had a multitude of slaves, who washed his feet continually. He had embraced Christianity, and went off across the jungle to the mission room 3 times daily, and all day on Sunday. He was a typical specimen of African aristocrat and spoke fairly good English. His one intense wish was to see English royalty, and confer some honorable degree upon them for bringing to his dominion salvation and sacramental rum, which he drank by the barrel. The one ambition of the chiefs seemed to be to take the sacrament. There they are out there, with all the old instincts, very much the same, notwithstanding the introduction of Christianity. When the white races have educated them, and equipped them with scientific weapons of warfare, who knows? They may assert their individuality, and strive to get their stolen countries back again. The truth is often spoken in earnest. It is as well to remember that in those vast African territories many millions of fine native men dwell, with a muscular power and patriotism equal to that of the peoples of civilized lands. The moving finger of destiny has always suddenly pointed to the hour of mighty events, with an ironical grin at our unprepared consternation. The West African bushland is the wildest under the sun. Nothing but short bush jungle and vast forests meets your gaze as you wander on from skyline to skyline in your caravan. And, as a ship passes islands on the trackless South Seas, often you pass a native village and hear the tom-toms beating away at their mysterious sound codes. In those isolated villages, far beyond the outposts of civilization, you will sometimes come across a white man who dwells alone with his memories. Sunk to a semi-barbarian state, they live with the natives, who have a deep reverence for them and their superior knowledge. They live on mealy broth and nut milk, and dress in the native style. When the white stranger from far off is seen approaching the native village, he is carefully scanned through a telescope by the white exile ere the latter shows himself outside the native kraals. Men of the civilized western cities do not dream of the sad dramas of life that are hidden away from their knowledge far beyond the outposts of advanced civilization. London audiences cheer and weep in the theaters as the curtain drops before the footlights over the Mokiro's grief. But oh, if they knew of the great unknown, the sorrowful dramas behind the awful curtain of reality. While I was on the coast, I made the acquaintance of an elderly tourist who was gathering material for a book of experiences. He was extremely fond of music, cheerful, and a keen observer of character. When he proposed to me that I should accompany him on his travels, I was very delighted and at once agreed. We went by boat round the coast, he paid all my expenses and visited a host of villages, finally going as far as Bonbon and Crew, and many places whose names I have now forgotten. I remember many incidents of those early days, especially a white-whiskered old chief whose name was Tam. He was about 70 years of age, and had a wrinkled, wise-looking face and a bald pate. He loved to sit by his kraal, wrapped in his big brown blanket, and speak native wisdom. He was dead against the white men, and at heart was a genuine old heathen, and no fool either. Though he professed to have embraced Christianity, and possessed a Bible, he had sold many square miles of his dominion to white men, over and over again signing the documentary deeds, with many expressions of loyalty and blessings on the Great White Queen. It was afterwards found out that he had sold the same land to scores of different white speculators, who opened syndicates in London and sold shares to the unwary. When he was in liquor, he would reveal the true thoughts that burnt silently within him and longed for utterance. "Heathen me, forsooth! Ah, measly white-faced goat," he would shout when the missionary approached him. "Bring forth the mealy broth and rum, that I may toast these white skunks speedily to their hell." And saying that he would turn his dark, wrinkled face to the blue tropical sky and lift his war club, and off rushed his womankind from the kraal to do his bidding. Then he would turn to the white missionary, who stood with his broad-brimmed Panama hat tilted forward to hide the grin on his lips, and thunder forth, his big black lips fairly flopping with drunken passion, "Who is this white god that you prayed about, liar? Show me this one shadow that is better than my 50 gods. Show me him, and I will crush him, as I do this struggling flea." And saying this, he pulled his dirty blanket the tighter round him, and then held up to our gaze a flea between his thumb and forefinger. Then, with a sneer on his lips and much blasphemy, he would continue, "Give up my 50 gods, and trust to one indeed." And then down he would crash his club, as all his old wives, squatting by the kraal, quivered in their skins. "Ah," he said, and his bright eyes winked humorously at the harem queen, a dusky beauty as black and bare as starlit night swathed in a wisp of vapor. "Pass me the bowl full, filled to the rim. Mind you." Then he would smack his big lips together and mutter, "Tribesmen, the white man's rum speaks more truth than his god of lies." The foregoing gives a pretty fair example of the real character of those old native chiefs and kings, who still cling to their old beliefs, and yet profess Christianity in much the same manner as they do in the islands of the South Seas. My friend and I were always on the move, sometimes riding and at other times walking. We tramped along jungle track for many miles, and often passed natives who came by us in their primitive caravans. We would wave our hands to them and watch them go out of sight, for the tracks wind along by deep gullies, swamps, and impenetrable forest lands. We hired 2 hammock boys. I was pleased, for they carried my violin and my friend's camera, also a load of photo plates and curios. South Sea Island heat is wintry compared to the dense, muggy atmosphere of the west coast. By night, a white mist creeps out of the primeval jungle, glooms, and at dawn the sunrise looks ghostly, as it gleams across the glimmering slopes and gullies, and sparkles a blaze of forked chameleon light on the jungle world. Far away the natives are beating the tom-toms in the hidden villages as you walk along like a man asleep and scratch yourself, for each night was a nightmare of restlessness. Though we wrapped our feet up and sealed all the holes in our mosquito nets, we did so in vain. The mosquitoes got at us somehow, and their bodies were bloated with our blood long before dawn. Ants, too, abound, and they are as big as half a walnut shell, and go moving along in vast battalions, attacking friend and foe alike. There are centipedes also, and when one rises from one's extemporized bed, they rush off on 1,000 legs to hide from the sudden blaze of light. Thick grass, 10 feet high, and fern trees a foot higher, grow on the jungle slopes, and at dusk they are afire with crimson and yellowish blooms. Tropical orchids and flowers one has never seen before. One evening at dusk, we arrived at a village called, I think, Kaf. King Beloa ruled the dominion, and the priests consulted Rouge. The Ruru is a hideous idol, carved to satisfy the heathenish ideas of the African natives, who still worship wood and stone, as the islanders did in the South Seas years ago. Polynesian islanders are educated gentlemen, compared with the usual run of West Coast and Nigerian natives. As we crossed the river by a bridge of logs that divided the village from the jungle, we sighted a tiny city of huts. We waved our hands and approached slowly, with a little apprehension. The king or high chief, dressed in an old pink striped shirt, came out of his kraal and welcomed us, His face looked like a black, gnarled tree trunk carved into human shape, till his thick-lipped mouth opened with a smile, revealing 3 or 4 remaining teeth. He held over his frizzly head a large white umbrella, a present from some trader, which intensified his dusky shade. Out of the huts under the jungle palms came the ebony-colored population, good-humored looking men, women, girls, and pickaninnies. The king invited us into his palace. The skulls of fallen foes ornamented the door. We stepped inside the royal kraal and were somewhat surprised by the comfortable native tapestry, made of fiber and woven grass of various hues, covered the walls, and the floor of the first apartment was hidden by thick matting, on which squatted several ebony-colored females, who belonged to the royal harem. As we entered, they started jabbering and rolling their dark eyes. Chairs and tables covered with matting made up quite a decent amount of furniture, evidently purchased from traders. A ruru, surrounded by empty gin bottles, stood in the doorway of the next room. It had fierce-looking glass eyes, and a face that looked half human and half crocodile. We expressed delight at all we saw, for we were alone there, and felt that by being friendly with the chief we were keeping on the safe side. Then the old high chief stood erect, and had his photograph taken. He was as pleased as a child with our attentions. I played the violin to him, and he was greatly delighted as I scraped away. His eyes glittered with pleasure and curiosity. I made him hold the violin, and he made several scrapes. His fat lips widened with fright until they reached his ears when the strings wailed. That night, as sunset smudged with a yellowish gleam the misty, heat-laden horizon, and a myriad creeping insects came forth to hum and buzz, Mr. Tandai graciously accepted King Beloa's invitation to attend a village ceremony. He made signs to us and said, "Much good you like see," wrapped a large brown blanket, red-striped, about him, the very sight of which made us perspire, for the heat was terrific, and majestically slinging one end over his shoulder, walked in front of us, to lead the way to the jungle ballroom. I saw a sight that night which outdid, in grotesqueness and lewdness, anything which I had seen in the South Seas. The royal opera box was a square-rigged set of bamboo poles lashed together with strong native fiber. Mats slung over the crossbars made comfortable seats, elevated about 6 feet, whereon Mr. T and I sat, and the chief with crossed legs in the middle. For native girls had just reached maidenhood, and had been sold to 4 respective husbands for so many bullocks. It was the custom to confer on such maidens an honor which, to Western civilization, was one of great degradation and shame. Afterwards the girls were brought forth to stand in the middle of the cleared jungle, so that the whole tribe could gaze upon them as the festival dancers whirled round them. There they stood before us, revealing a similar timidness to that seen in a young bride at an English wedding. The king started the applause by striking a huge bamboo rod on the side of the primitive opera box as he drank large bowls of palm wine. He was soon drunk, reeled and shouted, "Foo-foo, ki-ki." The glimpsing moonlight streamed through the palms onto the maidens' faces and onto the dark hordes of shrieking natives who whirled around them. Those erstwhile maids stood embracing each other, then unclasped, chanted and clapped their hands in rhythmic motion, and then, to the delight of the assembly, imitated every gross gesture. My friend kept close to me, and I to him, as the besotted king slipped off his seat and fell onto the next rung, still shouting, "Ki-ki." One of the maidens was really handsome for a negress. She had fine eyes, full lips, and a well-rounded figure of light mahogany color. The curves of her body resembled a Grecian bronze. She stood for a moment perfectly still in the moonlight, with one knee timidly crossing the other, ere she turned to show her comeliness to the admiring audience. As they sang, the native orchestra crashed away on tom-toms and wooden drums. Some plucked strings that were stretched across gourds. Others blew, with their big black lips, at bamboo flutes. They played out of tune, but the tempo of the primitive strains suited the dance exactly. "MVU," shouted the king, and then he made signs that I should play. Without a moment's hesitation, I held the violin to my chin and played like a happy barbarian, though my heart thumped with apprehension. Again they danced as I played on, and through my brain flashed reminiscences of my tribal solos in Samoa and elsewhere. Suddenly the circling ring opened, and from a hut close by came the dancers for the second act. By the throne they ran, dressed in grotesque festival costume, painted in hideous lines of white from head to foot. They looked like hordes of skeletons from the tribal cemetery jumping round living maidens. So rhythmically did they whirl, and so fantastic was the sight, that they seemed monstrous puppets strung on wires, pulled by some mysterious hand in the dark jungle. For often they would stop perfectly still, and then in the moonlight once more whirl away. How the audience of men, women, and children stared and clapped as they squatted on their haunches on mats. And they encored just as they do in the music halls of London town when the ladies in tights whirl and jump before fascinated audiences. There I sat with tea, gasping with curiosity as the king thumped, and playing on, far happier than when, dressed in an evening suit and tight, high collar, I fiddled in city orchestras, playing every night the accompaniments of the poor hits of the day to affected stage voices. Notwithstanding the apparent lewdness, their innocence almost sanctified the smiling scene of dark faces, and I realized that it was but a custom truthfully expressing primeval man's original idea of the beautiful. So we were not shocked, though we drank deep from the whiskey flask to steady our nerves ere the head chief sucked at it. The tribe encored me, and I played again. To my surprise, they got hold of the wild chorus of the Scotch reels and whirled around, shrieking it. They had musical voices and, I believe, good ears. The melodies they sang resembled wild laughter and song. The tom-toms banged and the flutes screamed between. This is the mirth music, as I memorized it. Next day we were taken round the village and entered many of the native homes. They were snug enough, with sleeping mats and bamboo furniture, and many boxes with little mats on them. In the corners were maize, yams, kola nuts, and gin bottles. The chief ornaments were the skulls of dead relatives. Comfortable crawls they were, though the furniture seemed scanty and reminded me of the homes of struggling authors, poets, and musicians in the large cities of the world. But these were happier homes, for the heads of the families were unambitious, save that they prayed for copious rains to fall on their yams and mealy patches. The richer natives wore ornamental garments and had honors conferred on them, such as foot washer or mosquito squasher to the king. Real poverty seemed unknown, and decrepitude and the complainings of old age ceased with the blow of a war. Artists engraved pottery, and musicians were much appreciated. Poets were applauded, and in all the villages I came across were looked upon as exiled gods. When they spoke, their wisdom and native lore were listened to with rapt attention, as though the great god Odyssey had spoken, a strong contrast to the neglected poets of civilized lands, where poetic voices cry in the wilderness to deaf ears. William Watson, Robert Bridges, Chesterton, Blakemore, and all the other voices of modern music would have found a large measure of appreciation in that land, had they been born there, for it was an El Dorado for poets. As for John Masefield and Kipling, they would have stood on stumps and sung till all the coast villagers, through sheer poetic delirium, put out to sea for other lands and wild, poetic adventure. Lovers of Wagner would have rejoiced to hear the strange primeval music that expressed the true barbarian note of joyous or wailing humanity. And after hearing that which I heard, they would more easily have understood the deeper meaning of the celebrated maestro's compositions. I played several solos to the king next day as he sat in his hut room, and he touched me with the dead king's thigh bone on the neck, and so gave me the equivalent to a British knighthood. We were taken before the favorite harem queens. They blushed and smiled, showing their white teeth, as T and I bowed and gesticulated our appreciation of their dusky beauty. With all their apparent sins, they seemed deeply religious. We knew not what their creeds expressed, or on what mythology they were founded. We only knew that Abasi and Soko were great gods, and their subjects were life and death, as in all creeds they must be. Their arujas were hideous enough to express the agony and ultimate end of all we know and all that is born of flesh. The rujas they knelt before were as deaf to their appeals as the images of the Virgin Mary and other idols of Catholic and Protestant high churches are. When we left King Baloa, we wandered on mile after mile and continually entered other countries, for you cross frontier lines at every river and swamp, and come across tribes who speak a different dialect and worship offshoot gods. the Akanaka tribe, Egbosh, Apiongs, and many others. On the rivers sailed dugout canoes, long enough to hold from 12 to 15 natives, and smaller canoes wherein ebony youths paddled their sweethearts and sang the latest tribal hits. All the villages were familiar with white men. 4 traders came long distances, from Sierra Leone or the Gold Coast, and from Calabar to bargain for copra and palm nuts, and many other things. Slavery was in vogue, and rich chiefs bought young girls and youths, and took them into their homes. I saw a witch scene, much like the scenes I had seen in Fiji. Hideous old women and men consulted the Ruru, then haunted the credulous natives with lying stories and prophecies of good and bad things. I played the violin to several tribes, with the special idea of seeing how my music appealed to them. Some were curious only, and others seemed to enjoy the melodies. A native girl from Sierra Leone sang as I played, and had a really fine voice, with an earnest note in it. I think the West African natives, on the whole, have good musical ears and a genuine love for music, greater than that of the English people. I have heard native military bands perform, and heard no difference in the playing when compared, of course, with amateur bands in Great Britain. In one native village, we discovered a white man living. He was about 50 years of age, and very gray and sunburnt. At first he was reticent, but tea got him on some interesting topic, and I played the fiddle, and then he opened out. I cannot tell his name or what he said. He was not hiding, but was sick of life and wished to end his days out there with those wild men. I can still see his blue eyes gazing at us, among the black ones, as the natives stood by their village huts and waved goodbye as we tramped off. The population of Ashanti was very mixed. Moors, Mohammedans, Negroes, Arabs, and many more, who had emigrated across the Sahara to the west coast in ages past, had left their types in the blood of the natives. We went to Accra, Akamabu, and Zakandi, where we stayed with an old chief who was about 80 or 90 years of age. He had white whiskers, and was shriveled up like a mummy, but he was a most interesting man and spoke good English. He had fought under King Osei Tutu, the Ashanti king who in 1822 defeated the British, who in turn revenged themselves in 1826 on the Pra River. Finally, T and I took boat for Lagos and arrived on the coast of Nigeria, where we saw native life and tropical bush that differed very little from that which I have already described. All the villages were similar, and their semi-barbarian population lived under their old customs, modified to suit the requirements of the British commissioners. The natives all seemed prosperous and fat. Rent and clothes did not trouble them, so they traded, and kept the proceeds for their immediate requirements. The bush was dotted with mahogany, ebony, camwood, and yellowwood trees. Rubber and oil palm were cultivated. Long stretches of dry weather prevailed, and then a thunderstorm came along and seemed to shake the very mountains. The natives put their gourds and calabashes out, and the deluge filled them in 5 minutes. Rivers that were tiny brooks rose in half an hour, and tore along in foaming, swirling torrents, washing a village away. T and I saved the life of a native child as it passed us on the thundering flood. It was still in its sleeping basket and looked up and yawned, only that moment wakened from sleep. As we grabbed it and pulled it ashore, the naked mother came flying towards us, waving her arms. When she saw her baby, and realized we had saved it, she embraced us and wailed with gratitude. We blushed, and after the storm, T got his camera ready and took her photograph. She was extremely self-possessed. Indeed, semi-savage African women lack the virtue that white women have. Their color does not reveal their blushes. One day we saw a native funeral. I think it was at a village called Out. We were walking along a jungle track, some miles from Madiba, on the Cross River, when we came to the village. It was the evening, in drought weather, and we smelt the village as we approached the clearing. The village orchestra was in full swing. Drums, native pipes, clappers, tom-toms, and bamboo rattlers, horns made of elephant tusks, all were being used, and made, as you can imagine, a weirdly impressive combination of sounds. A chief was being carried to his last resting place. We were deeply interested in the scene that met our curious gaze. Wailing old men carried the coffin slowly along, and kept spitting, for the weather was muggy and hot. The chief had been dead some days. The coffin lid was unfastened, and we could see the dark, frizzly hair of the dead chief's head at one end and the toes at the other. Myriads of winged insects and flies buzzed above the body in the procession as it moved along. The head chief, who was just behind, kept drinking tumbo palm wine, which an ebony girl handed to him, and they followed him with a large calabash full to supply his thirst. T and I kept to the windward of the procession and puffed vigorously at our pipes, and holding our noses, we walked just by the side of the native military band that played the death march behind the group. Right ahead of the procession, just in front of the hearse of wailing natives, walked 8 elderly stalwart chiefs, who carried a monstrous root. Its hideous half-human face, with big glass eyes, stared backwards at the coffin and the procession as the whole group moved along. "Give me a pull at your flask, T," I said. Immediately he handed it to me, and then took a gulp himself. Presently the procession stopped at the far end of the village before a large hut. We made inquiries, and found it was the corpse's late homestead. The custom was to bury him under the floor. As they stopped, the sweating hearse of 20 mouths spat, and they lowered their grim burden before the hut tomb. All the mourners commenced a weird monotone of melody, a melody that had bars in it resembling an English hymn. As we stood at the end of the village watching that heathenish burial, and the high priest lifted his hands and chin up to the big Ruru's wooden face in earnest supplication to the gods for that dead man of his diocese, the scent of the jungle blooms came in whiffs to our nostrils. Sunset was fading, and as the coffin disappeared in the doorway, and darkness drifted over the whole scene, I seemed to be standing in the dark ages, alone in some vast dream of life's sad drama. But the jungle bird in the mahogany tree started to sing sweetly, and then reality stole over the village, and I heard the wails of the mourners sorrowing over the blight of creation. Real sorrow it was, and for all its grotesqueness, the same as the sorrow of the civilized races. Still the bird sang over my head. It was a jungle nightingale passionately pouring forth melody as the native voices afar died away, and I dreamed on till T touched me on the arm. For it was getting late and we did not wish to stay on in that particular village. We slept that night in another village called, I think, Echo. I shall always remember it because of the look on my friend's face as I shaved him. We only had one razor between us, and that was rusty. T was terribly scrubby, and he said, "Can you shave, Middleton?" "Yes," I said, and I lathered his smiling face with a mixture of fat and swamp water for 20 minutes, to make up for the razor's bluntness, and then started on him. He was a handsome fellow, but as I pulled the hairs out in batches, his face twisted and contorted till he looked like a Ruru, and the tiny black pickaninnies of the native village jumped and screamed with joy to see the white man's terrible grimaces. "Be brave," I said, and away came the skin of his chin. Then he performed on me. But I was younger, and only suffered half as much as he had done, as he scraped the down from my cheeks. A few weeks later we bade each other goodbye. I promised to write to him, but lost his address. I never saw him again, but I have not forgotten him, as he will see if ever he reads this. I have seldom had a more cheerful or intellectual comrade in my travels than T was, and I am sure he created fame by his facial contortions among the village children in the African village Echo. Years ago, you are never really lonely in the African bush, for as you tramp along the bush tracks with your swag a flask of whiskey and insect powder, wrapped up in your mosquito net, strange things follow you, singing and blowing tiny flutes in your ears, as they circle round your head, a dancing ring of tiny bodies on wings. Some of them hum at sunset, and if you feel poetical you can fancy you are out on the lonely track, with all the stars singing round you, as like some burdened creator you mumble to yourself and move, along with your myriad satellites following you. At night you are not companionless, for the festering heat makes you feverish and imaginative, as you lie down to sleep, after closely fortifying yourself from all living creeping things. The African moon steals up the sky, and noises sound in your ears. The hideous Ruru faces that you saw yesterday in the native village emerge, grinning, from the jungle, to peep and dance all round you. Some of them bend over you, put their wooden mouths to your ears and whisper, "Englishmen, Englishmen, go home to your people before you are dead." The fat lizards, gliding up and down the moonlit mahogany tree trunks, swell to a monstrous size as you watch, and jump right through your head. But pale shadow faces creep out of the jungle, faces with blue, kind eyes, and you recognize your own memories as caressing. Fingers, made of homeland dreams, touch your brow and at last you fall asleep. I have often rested by the track in the lonely bush, while birds puffed their throats and sang to me some sweet refrain that winged my heart overseas to England. And often at sunset, a bird would sing a strange song that made me feel as though I had been dead for ages. And the sounds of the native drums in the distant village came from ghostly battalions of the pharaohs calling me across hills of sleep. My dreams have made me one of the wealthiest travelers on earth. If I can take my best dreams to my grave, I shall be happy enough, for I shall own my own heaven, and the memory of life's hell will pass away. I remember once when I was tramping the Australian bush alone, I fell asleep in a hollow, and my dead brother, who was lost overboard at sea whilst going out as a sailor to Australia, crept out of the gum clumps just by my camp bed and lay beside me. I was happy and put my arm round him all night long, but I felt very miserable when I awoke and tramped on alone at daybreak. I tell you how I felt, because men feel as well as see when they travel the world. If we could only creep across the years and gather in a harvest of our boyish dreams and live them all again, how happy some of us would be. Now our days rush away, like the waters of the rivers too. The sea, we still call the rivers by the old names, but the singing waters of yesterday have gone forever. Our dreams are spiritual and beautify our brief existence. When we cease to dream, we are truly dead. The memory of yesterday's dream gilds the hollowness of today as flowers sadly beautify old graves. I have often met the dead walking the streets, avaricious skeletons without real eyes, and have touched their cold hands and felt the chill of death. I have also met the living where I least expected, at tin savage huts, in wild lands, where the inhabitants gave me their primitive food, with brotherhood or sisterhood breathing through their kind eyes, and then cried and sang as I played my violin to them. A bird singing at sunset, up in the banyans or coke palms, would appeal to their wild brains. Its tuneful throat expressed the voice of some infant goddess of their innocent mythologies. The wind stirring the forests, the noise of waves, all were voices calling to them from when the forests of those isles have disappeared, and the spires of the cities rise everywhere, the thundering wail and crash of the Fijian cathedral organ will fail to do that which the small bird did with its tiny tuneful throat. I have written of the seamy side of native life, both on the Gold Coast and elsewhere. But as in everything else, the bright side of the sorrow is also there. Years have changed many things, and the advancement of time has swept much of the dross away. The name of the white man's grave now sounds as primitive as King of the Cannibal Isle in Fiji, where once the swamp mist lay yellowish in the hollows. Sparkling atmosphere now shines. Drainage is plentiful, so the evils have departed. The gold mines are run on advanced scientific and medical lines. 40 miles from the coast are the Abantiakun mines, and the Abaso Brumasi, Anglo-Ashanti goldfields, and many others. Right up to Nigeria, with its tin mines, all is now healthy and cheerful. Elevated bungalows stud the heights round the mines. They are well drained, and as you enter the tent door of those dwellings, half hidden by jungle bananas and palm, you see the white man living in comfort and cleanliness that would often outrival the homes of his native country. The mine owners pay excellent wages to the whites, and the natives are ruled by fines and kindness. To whip a native, or to strike one, is a dangerous offense. The gold mines are a blessing to the West Coast natives. The wages they receive provide them with plenty for their primitive requirements. But they have to be strictly watched as they dig, for they hate work, and will try all possible subterfuges to save. Digging to the proper depth, gold is found almost everywhere, but not in payable working quantities. The country is chiefly owned by native kings, who sell their territory to the whites who go that way prospecting. I have met men in London who owned large tracts of jungle land in West Africa, wherein gold, 4 ounces to the ton, lay. They showed me the deeds, signed by the native king. But the next day I have met another man who owned the very same land and did not know the other owner. For those artful native kings sell the same tract of land to every white man who wants to buy it. So it is well to be careful in buying shares in Gold Coast mines, though the mines I have mentioned are equal to any in the world, and are equipped with the latest machinery. The managers from London go out there at frequent intervals, and the whole business is worked by educated white men. But for the black-faced natives and the surrounding jungle and bungalows, it might be in London's highest commercial center. Indeed, men employed by them are better off than in London, for they give splendid wages, palatial bungalows, and medical attention, as well as paying fares out to the coast, and home again when their employees' time is up. The bungalows are all on elevated country, and are consequently healthy. And now, wherever mines exist on the Gold Coast and in southern Nigeria, you come across smiling Englishmen enjoying the wild jungle life and smoking by the bungalow doors, while natives rush about, waiting on the Gold Coast potentates, for such they are. Often they go motoring, and the delighted natives go with them in the white man's wonderful train. When they reach the outlying villages, the whole population rushes forth to see the car tear along the jungle track. And if the hooter sounds, their black bodies fly off into the jungle in all directions, the pickaninnies too, all frightened out of their lives. Often one hears the tom-toms and native orchestra playing in the distance. The music drifting on the hot night wind across the jungle is impressively weird and carries one away back to the barbaric ages. The African natives for centuries have had a kind of mysterious wireless code. Warnings of the approaching enemy are drifted on the winds, from tribe to tribe, traveling through the medium of drum sounds, a tone code of quick taps and slow booms, for hundreds of miles down the coast and across country. If a great chief dies, mysterious drums beat and are heard miles away in the next village, where the villagers beat their drums in turn and pass the sounds on, and so it goes onward, to fade with the sunset into the last friendly crawl of the Dominion. Dear audience, wander if you must, but carry a steady core. Curiosity opens doors, yet character keeps you safe. Lead with kindness. A small act feeding, a frightened stowaway can turn fear into trust, and remind you who you are. Look with respect. New lands are not your stage. Observe, listen, and learn before you judge. Protect your health and spirit. Noise, heat, insects, and loneliness wear you down. Rest, prepare, and travel with companions when you can. Keep wonder and honesty in balance. Dream boldly, but settle your debts and own your mistakes. Integrity is the one passport that works everywhere. Most of all, let travel refine, not harden, the heart. Collect songs, not trophies. Accept that monotony and storms are part of any long voyage, and meet them with patience. If home calls, answer without shame. If the road calls again, go with clearer eyes. Wherever you stand on a quay, in a jungle, or at your own front door, choose courage, practice gentleness, and keep a little room inside for the next sunrise. When I got back to Sierra Leone, I was glad of a rest and stayed at the English hotel for a couple of weeks. At Freetown, I heard a Negro play the violin really well. He held the fiddle to his breast, instead of to his chin, and played Raff's Cavatina and La Serenata very expressively. I complimented him on his playing, and discovered that a Hungarian violin player had given him a course of lessons. He played African dances and melodies wonderfully well. We had a glorious time, that Negro violinist and I, in an old bungalow by a native village where soldiers and white men congregated. We gave concerts night after night. The men came from far and near and joined in the songs. Our small, extemporized orchestra played homeland songs. The exiles shouted themselves hoarse. We made up part songs and put our own words to them, and the natives came from the village and peeped into our bungalow with delighted eyes and ears as we scraped away. It was there that I wrote the melody that is now the trio of my military march, Sierra Leone. This is how it went in the original setting. A few years later, I made a military march trio of the strain and sold it to a London publisher. I heard it performed by Sousa's band at several commemoration festivals in New York City. I have heard many violinists, among them Joachim, whom I heard when I was a boy. While on a ship in the East India docks, I obtained leave from the skipper for a Saturday afternoon off, and full of excitement went to Sydenham and heard the great violinist perform at the Crystal Palace. To tell the truth, I was disappointed. He played a Viotti concerto, stood like a statue, and his fingers and arms moved with the ease of machinery. His bearded face was raised toward the ceiling the whole time, as though he saw some beautiful sight in the sky above the palace roof. It struck me as a very refined and intellectual-looking face. His playing revealed perfection in the trained artistic sense, but lacked the fire and emotion born of the singing stars. I heard Sarasate play at his villa near Bir. His nostrils dilated and pinched in as he played, and he had all that Joachim lacked when Joachim played in public, for he was a spiritual player. You could have thought that the angels were wailing and fingering his own heartstrings. MSA played rather like a saint, but seemed more conscious of his own ability, which destroyed the atmosphere of the public performance, which I happened to hear. Kublek I have heard twice, at Bournemouth and in New South Wales. He performed with Joachim's machinery-like ease. His double stopping revealed the perfection of the performer's ear, and the dexterity of the fingers that seemed to outdo the player's own heart. But it struck me as cold playing, as if the player's command over technique was greater than his musical temperament. I have often heard it said that the marvelous technique of Paganini is today the technical equipment of all violin virtuosos. I doubt it. Certainly they are not mentally equipped with his way of playing. When you look at Paganini's compositions, you see something that is the outcome of one personality, the white heat of genius, who first discovered the musical gold mines in the depths of the violin. What must the man have been whose genius was so intense that he invented that which all others imitate and call their equipment? Paganini could not leave his playing to posterity, but a true critic can look at those individual compositions and dream of the tremendous passion that inspired the maestro to leave us those fugitive echoes of his playing, for that is all they are. Paganini played like an inspired, deep-feeling barbarian. His style was not artifice and did not represent by artistic bowing and phrasing the niceties of polite emotion and the artistries of civilization. We have no compositions as he played them. He stood before his awestruck audience and extemporized melodies, chords, sparkling arpeggios and staccato and cadenzas that were all half forgotten when the intense musical fury of his heart ceased, and the magic fingers were silent. And so we have only hints of his style. His imitators scrape out phonographic records of his published compositions and say they are equipped with Paganini's art. I heard an English violinist, Henley, in London. I was off to Jamaica next morning and only heard him by accident. A friend of mine said, "Come in this hall." We went in, and I was astonished. I thought at first that the violinist whom I saw playing, with Joachim's ease and Sarasate's passion, must be some foreigner. But he was an Englishman. His double stopping was superb, with a passionate fire in it alien to Kublek's temperament, I should think. Altogether he was really the most artistic and passionate player I ever heard, Sarasate excepted. While he played, I realized that note that tells of genius, which makes you feel that the performer's violin and fingers are imperfect instruments, are not as great as the heart that is trying to express its depth of feeling upon strings. I went abroad after that. I have not heard since of Henley, the wonderful violinist. He was English, and I suppose London's fashionable musical world positively refused to go mad about an Englishman when so many German and Austrian violinists were about. I heard King Billy, the Australian Aboriginal king, play the violin by the curbside in Sydney. He was the world's worst great violinist, made a squeaking row and thought more of the cash the colonials dropped in his tin pot than of the melody which he performed. An artistic public performance on the violin is widely divided from the poetry of violin playing in solitude, out of sheer love to express the performer's feelings and relieve the tension of sorrow and joy that is oppressing him. When I was a boy, staying at Latchard in Sydney, I heard someone playing the violin and accompanying his playing with his own voice. The sound came from a little wooden house on a flat. I stood still and listened. It was dusk. On the window was a bit of scribbled paper, "Room to let cheap," that gave me a good excuse, for I was intensely curious to see the man who played and sang so beautifully. I knocked at the door and was asked in, and I got in conversation with the player. He was a Norwegian with a handsome face, but unshaved and worried. His wife was about 30 years older than he was, and as he played to me, she sat near and her old wrinkled face beamed with delight as I praised his playing. He played by ear and was I could easily see that, but he was a great violinist. He expressed his very soul as he played, in a weird, peculiar style, Norwegian melodies. I felt greatly drawn toward him as he played and sang to me, looking past me with steady, dreaming eyes as he extemporized sweet strains. He had hard, rough hands, through working on the roads. I saw him night after night. I thought at first that his wife was his mother, and I said, "Your son is a real musician," when he smiled at me and said, "My wife, not mother." I felt very uncomfortable. He took her old wrinkled hand and led her into the little kitchen and kissed her tenderly. I suppose Norwegian women aged quickly, or they had fallen in love with each other when he was quite a lad. But it was beautiful to see their sincere, sweetheart-like affection for each other. He secured a job on the Broken Hill silver mines, packed up and went off to Melbourne. I never saw him again. I often think of him and his clever, handsome face as he sat breathing heavily and playing and singing to me. He would have been better than Yogem and Kublik if he had had their technical equipment and no roadstones to break and ruin his hands. I cannot remember any special feelings when I heard the great violinists, Joachim Kubelik and Chrysler, except curiosity and momentary admiration. But the memory of the stone-breaking Norwegians playing is as vivid today as then. And when I think of it, all the poetic atmosphere of his playing still haunts me. So if it's true that time is the great critic of poetry and music, then assuredly, as far as I am concerned, my Norwegian friend was the greatest violinist I ever heard. It is difficult to define art. I suppose anything that appeals to the best emotions in men and women is art. A good deal of what is known as art today will soon be cast on the rubbish heap of the medieval ages with the old ideals and idols. People move in the realms of art as they do in frock coats. It must be just so, and must have 3 buttons on the front only. If it has 4 buttons, it's not art. Art should be natural and oblivious of fashion, and, like true religion, beautiful in rags and tatters, pale-faced, walking the streets of humanity, singing with the birds and stars, and looked down upon by affluence. Do the thousands who hear Wagner understand the depth and meaning of the music as Wagner thought they would understand? Do they hear the barbarian note in his music that tells so well of the savagery of the German people? The barbarian shriek, the exultation over the fallen and the tramp of bloodthirsty warriors, driving the helpless victims of the fallen cities before them? I do not think so. It's fashionable, and to have heard Wagner is to be in the fashion. And so off people go and hear and see Wagner. Most of them would more thoroughly understand and enjoy a phonographic record of a Solomon Islanders' cannibalistic dance, accompanied by living pictures of the scantily clad native men and women, beating their drums and whirling round the blushing bride, clad in half a coconut shell and her hair only. Their funerals are conducted with the same austere art that makes them all go and see Wagner. I like Beethoven and Mendelssohn's concertos, also Schubert's music, indeed all the really good classical compositions, but my memory of the old shanty, Blow the Man Down, as I heard it sung, and sang it myself, with crooked-nosed old sailors, as we rounded Cape Horn, with seas crashing over the decks and the Flying Scud racing the moon, the old skipper on the poop shouting, muffled to the teeth in oilskins, his gray beard swinging sideways to the wind as the full-rigged ship dipped and rolled homeward bound, is something of music, singing and haunting my soul, that will only die when my memory dies. I can still see the crew climbing aloft and along the yards, their shadows falling softly through the moonlit gray sails and yards onto the decks. Melodies from the sails aloft, gliding under the stars, still sing beautifully to me as I watch the sleeping sailors, far out at sea, in their tossing bunks. Then they stand by the galley door, with their mugs for the hot coffee, while the chief mate tramps away the night to and fro on the poop, humming "Soon We'll Be in London Town." Then, as I dream, the sails crumble in the moonlight, the decks are awash, sink and disappear. Sailors are struggling in the moonlit waters, their white hands are tossed up as they sink, one by one. And now daybreak steals over the skylines that fence that vast grave of wandering waters. Often memories play on the strings of my heart as I stand listening to the great orchestra of the winds, fingering the giant forest boughs, or to the noise of seas on the moonlit shores. I have been almost everything in my travels. stowaway sailor before the mast, bandmaster on a mail steamer, wet nurse to Samoan twins, Tiga bushman, boundary rider, woodcutter, sundowner, post digger, snow sweeper, in North America, painter, deckhand shilling a monther, and a liner stokehold, messroom steward, native overseer, private grave digger, author, violinist to South Sea kings and chiefs, solo violinist and orchestral violinist in the large cities of the world, music teacher, songwriter, cornet player, composer of music for military bands, actor and singer, trader, canvasser for crank patents and medicine, banana planter in Jamaica, nut planter in the South Sea Islands, gold miner in Australia, violinist to geisha girls in Japan, and the leader of numerous splendid schemes that mostly failed. Glorious schemes they were, but you can never be sure of anything except that you will be certain to attend your own funeral. Their mother, a native woman, was drowned by the upsetting of a canoe. A Norwegian sailor and I found the infants, screaming, in a hut on the coast. We secured a ripe coconut, and opening the eye hole in the shell, we placed it in turns at the mouths. They both tugged away and pressed the shell with their hands as though they were at the breast, and soon went off fast asleep. In the morning we gave them into the charge of a native girl, who took them both away to the dead mother's relations. I have also been a poet. I wrote a little volume of Australian lyrics, which are all burnt now. I was so pleased with the first proofs that I put them on my bedroom mantelpiece, so that I could see them ere I slept, and directly I awoke at daybreak. The reviews in the newspapers and journals thrilled me, full of sincerity, spirit and impulse, marvelous descriptive ability, a real barbarian poet of the South Seas. I thought my fortune was made, and I could not sleep through thinking of coming fame and fortune. I thought surely such reviews in the newspapers will sell thousands of copies of my book, and I was very happy over my bright outlook. It was summertime. I became restless, and with the reviews in my pocket, I went off, walking very fast in my excitement. I soon arrived in the country at a beautiful spot. A windmill on the hilltop whirled its big black hands as though trying to catch the winged music of skylarks in the deep blue morning sky. By the lane side stood a cottage for sale. The very place for me, I thought. I will buy it and write there. What glorious poems of Australia and the South Seas they will be. The bird singing in a clump of firs just by my future front door rippled out notes as though its little body would burst with joy. I took an old envelope from my pocket and started to write a lyric how happy I was. Even the lyric was good. A month later I wrote to the publisher and said, "Dear Sir, will you kindly send me a check in settlement for copies of my Australian lyrics sold? I would not trouble you before the quarter, but unexpected calls on my purse have arrived at an inopportune moment." 2 weeks later, I received this reply. "Dear Sen, reply to yours of the 16th. No copies of your book have been sold, and we would call your kind attention to balance of £2, 10s, overdue for binding, and £1, 18s, for corrections and proof, etc., and 9 south, for D, for postage and sending out review copies." So ended my volume of poetry, though I must add that the publisher turned out a good sort. I would sooner deal with publishers, some of them, than with stokehold bosses and concert managers. Music and book publishers cannot publish authors' inspirations that do not sell and keep the author as well. I wish they could. As for the reviewers of my poetry, they made me feel the happiest of aspirants for 4 weeks, and I feel grateful for that 4 weeks of greatness. I think it was after a voyage to the Cape that I stayed in London for a week, and then secured a berth on board the S.S. Port Adelaide, a tramp steamer. We called it Las Palmas, and then went slap bang across the world for Sydney. It was a monotonous voyage. We had a stowaway on board. They sent him down into the Stoke. He had been a London street Arab and street singer, was a jolly youth, and sang "The ivy and the myrtle were in bloom." Then he came round with the hat and got tobacco from the amused crew. The sailors encouraged him to tell his experiences and were delighted to hear how he carried parcels for passengers at the railway stations, and often bolted with the parcel if it looked valuable. He would finish, and then take his tin whistle out and blow it, do a jig, and sing some mournful street prayer. We had very bad weather after rounding the Cape. Running the Easter down, There were 4 passengers on board, and 1 died of consumption. He lay on the hatchway for 2 days and nights. The weather was so bad that we couldn't stop the ship and decently bury it. He was canvassed up and weighted with lead, and seas came over the body all night long. We crept by it on deck like frightened shadows. When it was calmer, the captain said the burial service, and then all the crew, standing round the tied canvas length, said amen. Then gently, with the chief mate, I pushed it forward into the grave of wandering waters and heard the awful plump as it touched the sea. At once, the bell in the engine room rang full speed ahead. The engine started banging and we were off again. About a week after that, we sighted a full-rigged sailing ship bound for New Zealand. A Shaw Saville boat painted with white squares. She was doing about 12 knots and coming right across our bows. The mainmast was snapped off by the mainyard and 2 of the boats were gone. She had been through some terrible weather. She came dipping and rolling by, so close that as we looked over the side, we saw the apprentices wave their hands. We all waved back as she passed by, dipping her flag to us, and we saluted back with ours. I felt a choky feeling as I watched her pass, with her broken spars and torn sails, flying away towards the mist of the sunset. The figurehead with hands stretched in prayer at the bows. The white-crested curling waves lifted their arms and plucked at her sides as she went rolling and pitching by. There was something in the sight of that beaten ship that inspired me with more tenderness than anything I have ever seen at sea. I would often sit in the dim oil-lit forecastle as we swayed and dipped along. The tiny round portholes lifted to the fall and rise of the bows, revealing the tossing blue moonlit seas outside. In that roaming home of merchant sailormen, at regular intervals, came the steady-drawn, thundering music of the steamer's onward plunge as the screw urged her across the world. From the middle of the deck roof swung the oil lamp, its faint beams showing the outlines of the huddled sea chests on the deck floor and all around. The narrow coffin-sized bunks wherein lay the sleeping or wakeful crew. Some snored, their bearded mouths wide open. Others smoked and made ribald remarks, as Jim English the boatswain, a typical sailor of the old school, yarned of long-ago voyages on Unchanged. A real old shellback he was, and the only sailor whom I ever heard use the expressions, shiver my timbers, and avast there. I had voyaged in many sailing ships and tramp steamers, and mixed with many crews in foreign seaports. But never till then had I heard a living mouth utter those ancient nautical phrases so familiar to me in my old sea novels. Stow your gab, holy Moses, who the hell? God lummy and gorblummy were almost the only typical remarks in which sailors of my experience expressed their various moods. This old shellback, Jim English, was about 65 years of age, and had sailed the seas before most of the crew were born. Sitting on his huge brown sea chest, he would half close his eyelids as I played. "Give us that again, matey. My old mother sang that to me when I was a nipper," he would say as I scraped some old melody out of the carpenter's cheap fiddle, and his thin, wrinkled lips smiled as though he dreamed pleasantly in sleep. I never tired of listening to his yarns as he sat and took bites from his tobacco plug, his kind gray eyes moving quickly as he brought his fist down with a crash to emphasize the main facts of his wonderful tales. At night, when the wind was blowing and you could only just see the outlined forms of the watch tramping to and fro on the bridge, he would sit and tell us eerie things, how he had seen the Phantom ship off the Cape on moonlight nights, dead shipmates climbing aloft among the gray sails, singing shanties. "Chummy," he would say, "my wife's been dead these 20 years. But often at night she sits on that old sack by my bunk there, looks at me in the old way and says, 'Jim, keep off the booze, and don't make the round trip a dead horse.' And never a drop have I touched these 10 years. And the old girl comes with me and sits there and looks at me with her laughing gray eyes on every trip. Now, so earnest was he that our heads instinctively turned as we looked at the sack in the dark corner. We half expected to see his dead wife sitting there staring. He believed implicitly in dreams, for all the dire disasters of his life had been foretold in them. He was a kind of old priest of the sea. He wore an oilskin skull cap, and looked upon all of us as mere children, and we felt like children as we listened to his advice and experiences. He had cures for all our ailments, and was most superstitious. Once while he was yarning and sewing his socks, he put one of them on inside out. Suddenly discovering it, he whipped it off, then turned almost purple to the center of his bald head and said, "Now I've done it, mates. Some cursed thing's sure to happen before the trip's over. I've lost 4 shipmates overboard and all through them putting their socks on inside out." As he said this, anguish wrinkled his sea-beaten face, and I too almost cursed the unfortunate mistake. The sailors shuffling cards at the forecastle table looked over their shoulders, through wreaths of tobacco smoke, and wondered. As for me, I believed all he said. My awestruck eyes watched him as he yearned on and fed my imagination till I was a child again. His personality filled me with admiration. I almost worshipped him. I really think if he had mutinied and secured the old tramp steamer, I should have followed him, as a son his father, and thrown in my lot with him. Nor do I exaggerate in saying this, for his weird personality took me out of myself and a way back. He refired the magic blaze, the still smoldering embers of my boyhood's romance. And I was romantic, almost to madness, as a boy. Old bearded heroes, with unflinching eyes, stared through my memories, and fell, striking that last brave blow for right. Beautiful women, running by the magic moonlit sea foams of undiscovered shores, stretched their arms seaward as the wooden galleons with reefed topsails stood inland for the shore. Forlorn love-lit eyes shone like stars through the dead sunsets on the skylines of vanished yesterdays, till I heard the windy poplar trees wailing in the lanes outside my bedroom window and the robins singing on the leafless apple tree. Once more the stolen candle shone, and the light never seen on sea or land blazed through my eyes, as I traveled across magic seas and enchanted distant lands peopled with warriors and the beautiful creations of the torn novel by my bedside. That old sea priest loved hymns. He was truly religious, and often sat turning the leaves of his well-fingered Bible. "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide" was a favorite hymn of his. I think I must have played it to him 100 times, so that now the melody to me suggests ships far out at sea. And the old shellback whom I loved used to sit on his sea chest, telling us boys of the wooden ships that went down the seas and came back from other lands laden with scented cargoes, and that have faded away into the romantic dreams of this generation. The remainder of the crew were a mixed lot, not very different from the usual run of sailors on tramp steamers. They were quiet men, and had little to do with the firemen and trimmers, who inhabited that half-forecastle that was portioned off for them. I remember one of them was a shilling a monther, working his passage to the colonies for his health. He was a fine broad-chested fellow, but in consumption, and whenever he was off duty he seemed to be busy rubbing his chest with oils. He had quite a dozen bottles at the foot of his bunk, which he had purchased in London from quacks. Each bottle held oil that was a certain cure for consumption. We were very friendly with each other. I often helped him and, following his instructions, rubbed his back with the oils till the flesh was red. His little hacking cough would disappear for several days and he would be quite cheerful. Then the cough would return and blood-spitting follow, and I felt very sorry for him, especially as, when he felt better, he would hit his chest with his fist and show me that he was at last cured. Playing cards or dominoes, sleeping and smoking were the usual excitements of the crew. On duty, they washed the decks down with the hose, tramped their watches, rolled ropes, cleaned brasswork, and followed the most monotonous life under the sun. After rounding the Cape to run the Easter down, they became busy with the sails, which helped the engines, when the wind was fair, to urge the vessel on the lonely voyage. A trip across the world on a sailing ship is very different from a voyage on a tramp steamer. She rides the waves and seeks the winds, and like a mammoth bird thing, with men singing shanties, climbing along the bones of her spread wings, she races the clouds that fly overhead, and seems to sway the moon, stars or sun, as she rolls and pitches along. The crews of sailing ships when I was a boy were a different type of men from the crews of tramp boats. They were real sailors, or young fellows who had taken to sea life to learn to be sailors. A few of the old-time men among them, with their weather-beaten faces and old sea ways, gave that atmosphere to the forecastle that is now gone forever. It must have been the romantic dreamer's paradise to go down to the sea in sailing ships before the world was worldly. I can imagine those old sailors, uneducated and superstitious, on the great ocean waters watching the skylines and the dying sunsets as they dreamed of undiscovered shores, or by night on deck fancied they could hear the breakers beating against the starlit skyline where loomed the shores of eternity. Time and science have swept all that away from the sea forever. Today the seaman stands on the deck and thinks of the latest trade union grievance. The ways of the ocean no longer suggest eternity behind the stars, or undiscovered lands afar inhabited by strange peoples. To him, the ocean tracks are simply the main highways to New York, London and the colonial cities, and two ports that are like railway stations of the high seas. Passengers get off at Suez, Colombo, Sydney or Apia, and catch the next boat or train as the quartermaster shouts, "All aboard! Make haste!" Ladies and gentlemen, rich puffing ladies and gentlemen with their daughters reship, with their touring luggage for the next port, and they drag their deck chairs and pet poodles behind them. Old-time romance of thought has hardened and petrified into our stone-carved, gray terraced cities. But the blue horizons of dreams sparkle on forever. Yet with all, I have enjoyed two blessings in life. One is to have been born civilized, for I have never wanted to hurt a man or do anything really outrageous. The other is to have been born in civilized times that have enabled me to wander the world unarmed and safe. To have sniffed the tropical winds, seas and flowers of far-off countries, and gazed across primeval plains, or on the mountain peaks of lonely isles. To have heard the mighty silence of vast forests, and peered into the eyes of semi-savage peoples. The cook of that tramp steamer was a strange old seaman, who drank gin and seldom spoke. He had a gnarled, stolid-looking face and expressionless eyes, very deep-set. The green and flower of his youth had left him forever. Not a sentimental leaf or faded flower lingered in his memory. He reminded me of the mummified, blackened face of an old native I saw once, who still stood erect, just as he had died, in the hollow of a huge tree trunk in a forest of New Caledonia. A tree wherein he had taken shelter just before it was struck by lightning. Heat had blistered the dead face till it resembled gnarled bark. There was still a glassy gleam deep in the ice sockets, for though the eyes had gone, ants had eaten the back of the head away, and so light crept through from behind, where there was a small decayed hole in the tree trunk. It was very faint though, and as I stood a little way off, that awful facial expression reminded me of some hideous living mortal, whose soul slept mole-like in the cold winter sleep of age, dead, yet still alive long after the real owner had committed suicide by strangling all his passions. It is strange how such sights impress us and cling to our memory, for we meet dead men daily, whose faculties are fungus growths. We see their moving lips, shake their dead hands and wonder on the stony expression of their eyes, eyes that have not even the light of heaven behind them. As it lit up that Caledonia mummy's eyes, our captain was a naval reserve man who carried himself with incurable haughtiness. He saw life's great drama and the light of creation only by being awestruck at himself, and measuring all vastness from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The chief engineer was a jolly Scotsman, who tipped the convivial chief steward and so always had a bottle of whiskey under his bunk. When he was half seas over, he sang the Banks and Braes and Will the No Come Back Again, as the engines thumped and the tramp steamer rolled and pitched along the highway of the world. We ran into terrifically bad weather, and with the sails set for the wind was fair, the old engines crashed away as she pitched and the screw blades bobbed up behind. I have never followed the sea directly as a profession, but I have lived and communed with the hearts of sailors, held their hands in warm comradeship, as well as shared their hardships at sea and ashore. And so I have read them as they cannot read the sea or themselves. To the majority of sailors, to have been to sea, say for 20 years, simply means to them, I've been to sea for 20 years, and means nothing more. To have been able to go to sea mentally, as well as physically, and to have been thrilled by the wild poetry of the wind's songs and the romance of the sea, is to be in a strong sense a sailor of sailors. While the average sailor can still chew tobacco and tell you the names of ropes, women and grog shanties in distant seaports, I cannot even chew tobacco. But I can sit in my little room and watch the thundering seas tossing by my bedside, ablaze with the true light of sea romance, while sailing ships, with their crews aloft, singing shanties full of joy, pass and repass through my bedroom door, outbound for the seaports of the world. About a week later, the albatross that sailed the winds with restless eyes behind us, night and day wheeled round and put out for the open sea. For we were nearing the coast of Australia. I went ashore in Adelaide and got 2 shillings worth of tomatoes for a treat. The man on the wharf helped my chum carry them. They gave me half a hundredweight for 2 shillings. Adelaide is a real old colonial seaboard town. I bought a good violin there, and a lot of strings. We left next day for Melbourne, and I played the violin the whole way. In Melbourne the stowaway bolted, and the donkey man swore all the way to Sydney. For the careful London Arab started life in the new land with his go-ashore boots and shirts, as well as taking, in case of emergency, about 40 plugs of the cruise allowance tobacco. We did not feel sorry for the stowaway in his venture in a new life. He had the unnexing instincts of the old British stock, and we all felt he would do well in Australia. I very seldom made a round trip, and so, bidding the old bosun goodbye, after taking him ashore to hear him mutter for the last time "shiver my timbers," I left the ship. I stayed in Sydney for a few weeks and finally got on a Japanese ship, the Maru, and eventually arrived at Yokohama. I had never been to Japan before, and after tea I hurried ashore. On the wharf stood rows of Japanese low-caste women, dressed like guys. They had black teeth, and faces that looked as though they were carved out of yellow wood, and voices that went honk-key-honk-key-ko-kukeo, as though they had an orange in their throats. Their toes turned inward and their eyes outward, and Japanese flies built their hives in their thick, matted hair. It was hot, muggy weather. I was very disappointed at first, but when I got up into the city and found myself walking among crowds of fascinating Japanese people, all jabbering and shuffling along in clogs, I became interested. I had some dim expectation of seeing bamboo dwellings and oriental fairyland trees, with Japanese lanterns hanging on them, instead of which I saw fine buildings, well-lit streets, and beautiful parks with lakes in them, surrounded by maple and cherry trees. Boats were being paddled on the lake by Japanese girls, dressed in pale blue kimonos, and with hibiscus and cherry blossom in their hair. You can never forget that you are in Japan because of the strange language that hums in your ears as you pass along. Dreaming you hear the shuffling feet of some old ghostly Assyrian city, and the hubbub of the population talking across the silent ages. Next day I went to Tokyo. It was only a few miles away, about 20 I think. There I saw real old Japan, and went off into the Oriental Dark Ages. I saw painted red-lipped beauties with slit-shaped dark eyes and faces like dolls, being carried in sit-in chairs and copper-lid-shaped hats. Fanning themselves, they passed by and were carried to the palm house and down corridors to their mats. I made the acquaintance of a Japanese sailor. He was a genuine fellow, and took a lot of trouble to satisfy my curiosity. I was introduced to his family. They lived at Saraka, if I remember the name aright. I went into their house, a wicker bungalow, and was greeted with, "Oh heyo." 14 two daughters in kimonos, pink and orange yellow, waited on me, bowing and curtsying in Eastern style. The old mother was intelligent. She had a face like a South Sea idol, with kind, dove-like eyes. The room was covered with soft mats, and the walls of matted panels were carved with Oriental designs. I felt exceedingly happy as I sat by the Oriental maidens and ate savory rice and fowl and drank sake. The daughters screamed with laughter as I used chopsticks instead of the fork which they gave me. I slept there that night and went with the family next day to see the sights. Among them, the Asakasa Temple, where they worshipped the goddess Kwannon. Beautiful green land surrounded the Oriental city. Sarawana, my Japanese sailor sister, shuffled beside me, chatting away in Japanese as hard as her tongue could go, and pointing to the cherry and plum trees in full bloom. The quaint old mother and the others came on behind. They think a great deal of their cherry and plum trees, but as I gazed at them, I thought of dear old England. I did not hear the blackbird singing in those cherry trees. I only saw large crimson butterflies flitting over the boughs, and, on the fair slopes, strange bamboo-fenced instead of the country cottages and smoking chimneys of Kent. They enticed me to a tea room festival, where I had a large bowl of tea, the national beverage. I sat cross-legged on a little mat by Sarawana, whose bright eyes sparkled and whose red lips often parted in a cheery laugh, revealing her pearly teeth. Geisha girls played samisens and biwas and danced in oriental curves round us. They were mostly pretty maidens, with small white teeth and eyes that peeped beneath their penciled brows, like the frightened eyes of squirrels. They had beautiful hair too, with a bit of the national cherry blossom stuck into it. As they sang and strummed on their stringed lyre-like instruments, they seemed perfectly oblivious of all around them. Their oblique eyes seemed to gaze on something miles away. Sarawana had been a geisha girl and played for her living as I had, and so we became comrades. Next day I took her and her sister down by the river. It was a beautiful spot. The banks were smothered with cherry and plum trees, camphor woods and bamboos. "Why are you so sad, Sarawana?" I said as I sat by her side. Her sister sat with a Japanese lad among the bamboos, just by me, Lighty Samaro, and he dead. And then she sang a little Japanese song, after wiping her eyes with the big sleeve of her blue kimono. We were quite alone, only the little yellow birds twittered in the plum boughs overhead. "What does that song mean, Sarawana?" I said, and then she told me, in pidgin English, its meaning. "Unblown the cherry blossom blooms are hid in the cold of dead lips, weeping to blossom, and crescent moons of coming springs are pale forever in thine Iso, my love. Kwannon sits on her throne, pale as chrysanthemums, waiting the as camphor trees sigh over thy grave. Oh my son, did you love him much, Sarawana? Me lighty him as the birds, the bows, the river cry of him, oh my son." Then I tried to comfort her. "Laugh and be happy, and come on the river in a pleasure junk." For as I spoke, a Japanese boatman beckoned us, laid his rowing poles down, and started to bargain with me. Then Sarawana answered, "Me light to you, geisha girl, want be app little while." "Of course," I replied, and then she said, "Samaro dead, but he know me goody, and white man know he too." Then she lifted her pale blue kimono and revealed her tiny, clogged feet and ankles as she stepped into the junk, and by my side, singing melody and words that I could not understand, she went down the river. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, sympathized with the sad little geisha girl, and admired her modesty and poetic tenderness for the dead youth that she loved. I saw many geisha girls and Japanese women of all classes, but they were not all like Sarawana, and so I tell you of her. Japanese men and women are very much like the white races. Just one difference marks their characters with a ray of spiritual light. The girls, boys, women, and men of Japan are poetic. Everything about them is a symbol. A butterfly sat on Sarawana's hand. It was a kiss of her dead lover. And when it flew away, it went back to his grave to kiss the flowers and make him happy. The birds in the plum trees sing old love vows. Their wings fading in the sunset are the beautiful thoughts of the dead or the living flying home to heaven again. Japanese eyes shine with tears of joy as they think of those things at which English girls and boys would toss their heads back and scream with laughter. I did not return to my ship, but stayed at Tokyo till my money had all gone. For a while I stopped with my Japanese sailor friend. He was a generous fellow, and invited me to stay with him and his people as long as I wished. I taught Sarawana to play some easy melodies on my violin, and I was surprised at the quick way she picked up fiddle. She taught me to play one or two Japanese tunes, and I sat outside her bamboo bungalow and played as she sang, and the cherry blossoms dropped on us from the branches overhead. I will not tell you all my experiences at Tokyo, but I made a bold bid to get a living out of my violin and secured several good pupils. A Japanese lady of note was one of them. She was connected with the Mikado's court and had relatives in Tokyo. She paid me well, and I made good headway with her, and she was exceedingly kind to me. I also had a few English women as pupils, and went to Yokohama to give 2 of them lessons daily. Sarawana persuaded me to get up a kind of geisha orchestra. She played second fiddle and the cymbals. I ventured forth to a grand festival with my Japanese geisha troupe. When it became known that I was friendly with the geisha girls, I lost my best pupils, though there was no harm in anything that I did. Sarawana's mother was pleased with our venture, and was delighted when she saw her daughters dressed up in brilliant kimonos, and decked out in sashes of rich yellow and blue, with red flowers in their hair. I thought more of the novelty of it than I did of the money I might make. How romantic it all seemed as we marched along, laughing, under the white-blossomed cherry trees in far-off Japan. I did not know that professors and teachers of English ladies should not go about with geisha girls. However, I enjoyed myself, and my memory of Sarawana intense, her sister, as I called her, and her geisha friends is sweeter to me than the memory of those pupils I lost. My geisha troupe failed, and I secured an engagement as violinist at a missionary hall. Sarawana and her family attended the meetings. I worked there for about 3 weeks and received a good salary. It was easy but unmusical work. I had to play the mission harmonium twice a day, on Sundays 3 times. The hall was always crammed with converts, old men, young men, and girls. Some of them dressed in Japanese costume and others in European. Some wore tall hats and white collars. They sang English hymns, though the words were translated into Japanese. The old men and women sang very much out of tune, but looked very earnest. Their wooden mouths opened and shut as I scraped away. The mission was conducted by English women missionaries, as well as by men. The Japanese women were very decent people, and when I left they made a collection for me and handed me quite a considerable sum. I composed a hymn and dedicated it to the society, but whether they ever published it or not I do not know. They said they would. When I bade my Japanese friends goodbye they seemed sorry to see me go, especially Sarawana and my sailor comrade. He had a wooden-looking face that smiled eternally, like a carved idol. When he was fast asleep on his mat beside me, he still smiled, and so he was a good comrade, for I was subject to fits of depression, and when the little Japanese maid would play her lament and sing of her dead lover, I used to wish she was not so faithful. I was then about 22 years of age, and had seen much of the world. Very often I would lie awake for hours, thinking of things that should have happened, considering the great faith I had in them. I sometimes thought of going back to England and settling down as a violinist, but then the thought of my country's terrible decorum quashed my longing. I had been a good deal in Queensland, and had several good friends there. Sad memories, too, of a bush girl's grave by the swamp oak gullies. Sometimes I longed for Australian bush scenes, as a lad longs for his own country. I had been to Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Brisbane several times since I first saw them, but things even in one short absence were rapidly changing. As the ships came in crammed with emigrants from all parts of the world, the surrounding bushland of the seaboard cities and towns was cut. Down and up went thousands of wooden houses. And so old spots disappeared with the bushland which the Australian hates. If you say to a colonial, I have been across hundreds of miles of your bushland with my swag, camping out, he hangs his head with shame, blushes, and says, I know, but we hope soon to cut it all down. I suppose you've seen our towns. There is no doubt about it. The majority of Australians born are ashamed of the wild bushlands, and love the streets and spires and walls of bricks and mortar. Up country it's all emigrant Englishmen, and a few Australians who were born there and so could not help themselves. As for me, I loved the bush and my memories of the bush. And when I went to the old spots and saw wooden homesteads standing on the slopes where I camped by my bushfire, I felt sad about it. Even world-weary and old as I looked across the few years and saw the hollows and far-off forest trees waving in the moonlight dusk for miles and miles along the shores of my memory. So I began to think of Australia again as I lay in bed at the Grand Hotel Yokohama and dreamt of my old days there. I could not go back to Tokyo, at least anywhere near the mission folk, for I had told them I was going straight back to England. I had really intended doing so, but I thought I could get a berth on a ship and save my few pounds instead of paying for my passage. In the end, I was left almost penniless and stranded in Yokohama. I lodged for a while at a European's house. He had married a Japanese woman and kept a kind of sailor's lodging home. I had some strange companions in my rooms. I think they were Muslim, Buddhist, and Brahmin men. They were fierce-looking fellows, wore white turbans, and had swarthy faces with curly close-cropped beards. They knelt on little mats and prayed and chanted day and night. I found out after that one or two of them were men. Their ancient-looking faces wore an Omar Khayyam-like expression. From them I heard about Astoreth and Osiris, Allah Muhammad, and a lot more about Oriental and Eastern creeds. I noticed that they were all very earnest in their prayers. And when I walked suddenly into my room to fetch my violin one evening, two of them were kneeling in prayer at the window, worshipping the sunset. They never turned a hair at my interruption, but went on pouring forth solemn, strange words to the dying fires of Japan's horizon. It seemed to me then, and now, that all the so-called creeds were but one vast monotheistic cry, in various dialects, each creed a different expression only, all of them instruments in the vast orchestra of life's drama, playing for the same and universal hopeful harmony. The stars vary in magnitude and position, but they are all singing the same earnest melody, for they too are finite, and sing on as those strange men did in the Japanese Das house at Yokohama. I strolled along the wharfs at Yokohama Harbor with a young English sailor whom I met at the lodging home. We were both extremely hard up. Alongside the wharf lay the S.S. Port Pirie, and we resolved to make a dash for it and stow away. She was due to leave at sunset. The funnel was belching forth smoke. The sailors were standing with their friends on deck. With my violin in my hand, I walked straight up the gangway, my comrade just behind me. I was well dressed, and the quartermaster bowed as I slipped on deck and asked to see the skipper. "He's in his cabin, I think, sir." "All right," I said, and beckoning my friend as though he were my valet. I walked across the deck and along the starboard alleyway. We stood by the stokehold entrance and waited our chance. The hatchway to the coal bunkers was open. "Now," I said. In a moment, we had taken the final plunge and disappeared in the ship's bowels. Scrambling across the coal, we huddled close together and waited. It seemed ages before she went, and then we heard the rattling, rusty chain of the anchor coming up, and the throb of the winches, and the engines started. We were off. My dear old comrade, beside me, breathing in the darkness, was worth his weight in gold. "We're off now, Jack," I said, and he answered, "God knows where to, I don't," and laughed. We had some boiled eggs and a cooked fowl, so we ate something and then slept. When we awoke, the boat was rolling heavily. It was dark, though possibly daylight up on deck. I curled up by my chum and slept again. 3 days after we emerged, starving and sweating, choked with coal dust and looking like two dissipated Negroes. The chief mate said hello, and we gave a grim smile as he said, "I shall have to take you fellows up to the skipper." Up we went and stood on the bridge. The skipper gazed at us through the hot sunshine for a moment sternly. No land in sight as the boat cut across the Pacific at 12 knots. "Put them in the stokehold," he said, and then turned on his heel and started tramping the bridge once more. By heavens, I was not built for stokehold work. For a week we shoveled coal and became like skeletons, sweating all our vigor away. Then I played the violin to the engineers, and their chief got the head steward to appeal for my services in the saloon. My comrade had to work still in the stokehold, but I took care that he had good food. I commandeered tins of stewed Californian pears and meat, and built his strength up. He swallowed them down with coal dust and repaid me with grateful eyes. For out at sea with sailors, a fellowship exists that is almost unknown in the cities of the world. I suppose a ray of the illimitable gets into their brains. The vastness of the ocean, its endless skylines, and the ships appearing through them with singing sailors aloft, then passing away just as stars pass, singing something in the uncounted ages of God. These things unconsciously influence their souls, and they become children again, forgetting the respectability of civilization, and feeling the humanity that makes men die for each other in the desert spaces and oceans of the world. Men slumbering in affluence and the tribal pride of some dubious ancestry often appear soulless. Suddenly stricken with some grief or poverty, they reveal something really decent in their natures. Something that longed for recognition when the body waxed fat on food and pride in the barbarian deeds of their ancestors, deeds which done now would get the doer 10 years in Sing Sing or Wormwood scrubs. There's nothing like living on hardtack in a tramp steamer's forecastle, or on crab apples in the Australian bush, or in cities by playing the violin, to bring out the best or worst in men. Sorrow writes the true Bible of the universe and expresses all the poetry of existence. Though I have seen much of the world and had many downfalls, the atmosphere of my boyhood and its ideals remains. I still have deep faith in God's merciful providence, in the friendship of men, and in the earnest love of women. The old heroes of my dreaming boyhood still move with me as I travel on. The kindly eyes of earnest men and women shine through the mists of my memories and sweeten with light my dreaming existence. Not till I die will they die. I love to hear the laughter of children. Their innocent voices and little wails of grief express to me cries from the great heart of music. Till I fancy I can see the flowers growing over their inevitable graves. In that feeling I love all men and women, and those who have sinned have my unknown sympathy as well as my unknown love. Could I have my own way, I would lead a vast army to demolish the mighty cathedrals and churches of Europe, and to rob the wealth of the altars, selling the debris and giving the proceeds of the glorious battle in the cause of true religion to the thousands of starving little city children, providing covering for their tiny emaciated bodies. God would be my best friend in fighting for his helpless family and providing comfort for deserted women and fallen men. There is more true, unselfish religion in saving a butterfly's life than in moaning for many years in a cathedral pew about your next lease of life. But to return to my travels and troubles, I well remember that stowaway trip. The boat was bound for Sydney. We had beautiful weather, and when I was a legitimate member of the crew, I did not regret my headlong dip into the storm. My comrade and I were treated well, and my violin brought me respect and applause when I played in the saloon concert. My fiddle has always been a dear friend, and wailed passionately on my behalf when I have been in disgrace. I don't think I could find a more trustful and soulful companion if I started off to tramp the world again tomorrow. As we were flying through Sydney Heads, we received a message from the captain. He wanted to see my comrade and me on the bridge. He was an elderly, short-bearded man with kind eyes. "Well," he said, "I shall have to hand you two over to the authorities when we get in. Have you anything to say for yourselves?" "No, sir," I said. "Only we are sorry for stowing away, and wish to thank you for your kindness to us under such circumstances." He said, and then stopped walking to and fro to say, "Have you got any money?" "Yes, sir," I said. "We'll go ashore and clear as soon as we get alongside. I'll let you off this time." We both thanked him, and half an hour after the chief mate came up to us, and saying, "Here you are," handed us 10 shillings each. They do not always do that when you stow away, but that was my lucky experience. I can assure you that seafaring men are the bravest and kindest in the world. They know it and its ways by instinct. Whenever I hear of a captain going down with his ship, a lump comes up in my throat. Dear audience, the life you have just heard is messy, restless, and full of wrong turns. He has been almost everything, failed at almost everything, and yet he never truly lost the two things that mattered most: his curiosity and his heart. His book did not sell, his great schemes collapsed, ships rolled in storms, friends died, money vanished, but he kept moving, kept playing his violin, kept loving people that the world had already thrown away. The quiet truth behind all these adventures is this: a life is not measured only by success, titles, or safe choices. It is measured by how deeply we feel, how honestly we care, and how bravely we start again when plans fall apart. So if you are watching this and feel like a failure, or like your path is crooked and small, please remember this wanderer. Let yourself dream, even if your schemes do not work. Be kind, even when you are hurt. Protect the childlike part of you that still believes in friendship, beauty, and God, in whatever way you understand him. The world may never know your name, but your soul will know whether you truly lived. My next trip took me to Bombay, where I stayed for a few days at the English Hotel by Fort Hill. The tropical scenery struck me as very similar to that which I had seen at Colombo, and the heat as terrific, though feathery tamarisks and palms shaded the tracks. The white population were waited on by the natives. My father was correspondent for the Indian Times, and my parents had lived in Bombay before I was born. They knew a great many people there. In my pocket, I had a letter from home. If you go to Bombay, do go and see Mr. and Mrs. C, and whatever you do, dear, be well dressed. I had heard a lot about those great people when I was a schoolboy, so I did as I was bid and dressed up like a prince. When I arrived at the aristocratic verandahed building, I carefully dusted my boots with my handkerchief and knocked. When the door opened, and I gave my name to the native servants, an old man, the great C himself, came forward. He was polite to me, and I was the best dressed man in the house, so I did not begrudge the money I had paid for the loan of the suit at the Bombay tailor's. Before I left Bombay, I went to see my little brother's grave, Gerald Massey, S. Middleton. He was buried at Colaba Point, and I discovered his grave at last. A tamarisk tree was growing on it, and a few strange flowers. I felt the kinship of that little grave in a strange land. The earth did not hide from imagination's eyes the little dust beneath, which would have been my big brother if he had lived. I remembered my mother and father saying how they had felt when their ship went by Colaba Point, homeward bound for England, and they stood on deck and gazed inland and thought of their child being left behind. I knew how they must have felt as I stood there alone and gazed upon the little stone set between two large vaults. I felt intensely lonely. The Indian bees moaned in the flowers and palms. I saw my mother, a girl in years that day, standing weeping by her lost child. She still stood there in the sunset and shadow as I dreamed. I kissed her, picked a flower, and then walked away. The one solitary mourner that had come after many years, and probably the last. Next day I joined my ship and arrived in London 6 weeks later, only again to get a berth and go seaward, for the grim respectability of the city soon haunted me with its stony, nightmare eyes. The very atmosphere seemed to whisper, "Englishman, Englishman, are you respectable? Where's your Bible, your rent book, and your marriage certificate?" I seemed to hear that humming in my ears as I walked through London's streets, miserably cold. I shivered, and jumped into a cab at Waterloo and rushed off to Poplar. There was a man who lived there, in Abbott's Road, who was a crack hand at getting berths on the ships for us. In a week I was off down Channel, on a Chasseville boat, bound for New Zealand and Australia, as happy as a swallow flying south. The music of the sails, bellowing out and flopping to rest, the rattling rigging, the sailors talking and singing on deck, made me feel intensely happy, and yet half miserable as I thought of the ship sailing across the world to a civilized port. I stood on deck wishing there were undiscovered shores where waves sang, never seen by human eyes, and dreaming of old pioneers and heroes of far-off ages. I seemed to realize at a very early age that the light of the universe, the sun and stars were my religion, and their mystery my unfathomable mistress with divine eyes. When the tramp steamer, after toiling along for weeks at sea, sighted land, I stood on her deck the longest, as the far-off shores shaped themselves, and fancied I could see the old wooden pioneer ships and galleons that discovered them still hugging the misty shore as sunset died. Often when far out at sea, I would stand on the poop by night for hours, gazing astern, watching the star-like eyes of the albatrosses, flitting on the restless winds, till they seemed old heroes, my comrades out of their graves, on beautiful wings following the new ships. Then the mate would touch me on the shoulder and say, "Now then, young man, you didn't come to sea to dream." The crew wholly stoned the decks. The cook swore in the galley, as only a sea cook can swear. And the cabin boy, who had never been to sea before, said, "Is that New Zealand?" and pointed shoreward. As we rolled along, with all sails set, he stood on his head as soon as my back was turned, for I saw him in the glass of the saloon portholes. I knew how he felt. I returned to England on the same ship, and then got a berth on the Senesca, and went to America. A few years later, and I was again in Australia, on the P&O liner Britannia. A strike was on, and we lay out in Sydney Harbour for 2 weeks and used to go ashore in a tender every evening. One night I went ashore and played at a private concert out at Potts Point, and stayed the night as well. It was a wedding festival, and my host and hostess were kind, bohemian folk, relations of Sir Henry Parkes. I cannot remember their name. They used their influence and secured me a position to play at the government house balls in Sydney. I did so well that I got my box off my ship and left. At Government House, I played as a solo, my own composition, The Monk's Dream, which I had arranged for violin and pianoforte, and A Soldier's Dream Waltz, with variations. Among the audience was the present Lieutenant James Ordhume, who was on a tour through Australia, as adjudicator for the great military and brass band contests of Australia and New Zealand. Hearing me play, and finding that the solo was my own composition, he complimented me, and asked me to go to see him at the Occidental Hotel. I had a very good time there, for he was most hospitable. He was then about to leave Sydney for Bedtime. "Would you like to come on a trip with us?" he said. "Certainly," I answered, for I had a considerable amount of money just then, and felt that a holiday would do me good. Mr. Hume had not been to Ballarat before, and was delighted with the scenery passing over the Blue Mountains. In Ballarat, we had various experiences, and I worked, digging for gold, down the chief gold mine, the Warhoop mine. We went outside the town and got into the bush too. For though Ballarat is a beautiful town, with splendid buildings, one can walk in a very short time right into the bush, and see scenery equal to the Queensland landscape. The botanical gardens are also very beautiful and reveal patches of primeval Australia. We took snapshots of the Wendowie lakelet, because of the pretty little plump colonial girls standing by the banks. They were nut brown with the sun. Mr. Ordhume went out to see a friend who lived in the bush, but we only stayed 2 nights. There was a stable and swamp near our bedroom window, and when, after enjoying the squatters' hospitality and a musical evening, we went to bed, though we rubbed ourselves with kerosene oil and smoked, the mosquitoes charged down on our feet and faces in Hunnish regiments. At midnight we called our host, and he came to our door in his nightshirt, and told us to rub some whiskey on our faces and on our feet, and gave us a full bottle of the best brand. Directly he had gone, we closed the door, wiped the sweat from our perspiring brows, and drew the cork to rub our ravaged bodies. "Don't you think if we took the stuff internally and then smoked, that our breath full of the fumes would keep the cursed mosquitoes off?" I suggested. Mr. Hume quite agreed with my suggestion, which eventually turned out to be a most disastrous one for the mosquitoes. For we drank the whole bottle, and then went to sleep, and never felt one mosquito bite the night through, nor did we wake till long after sunrise. I think it was 4 days before the great band contest, which Mr. Ordhume was in Ballarat to adjudicate on, came off. The whole of Ballarat came to it. It was at that contest that I first became enthusiastic over bands. I felt the fire and go in the Australians' performances. Their bands cannot be beaten the world over. We saw a good deal of life in Australia together before I left Lieutenant J. Ordhume. A few weeks after the Ballarat concert, arranging to see him later in New Zealand, where he was going to adjudicate at other band contests. I went as a passenger on a boat to New Zealand, and when I had been a few days in Auckland, I saw by the newspapers that Mr. Hume had arrived to judge the great New Zealand band competitions at Masterton and elsewhere. I managed to be there. The weather was glorious, also the applause of the New Zealanders as the bands marched by. I traveled with Mr. Hume by train over the Rimnatuka mountain from Wellington to Matt. It took 3 engines to take the train over the rocky ledges and slopes. The grade is 1 in 15 in many places. The bushland and mountain scenery is equal to anything in Australia, for the scenery of New Zealand is wildly magnificent. After Mr. Ordhume had judged and conducted the massed band performances at Auckland, he kindly invited me to join him, and we went off sightseeing, visiting bushlands, rivers, and hot springs, old tribal battle spots, and Maoris and their people. Maori guides led us up mountains and across volcanic chasms, and took a great deal of trouble on our behalf. They knew that Mr. Ordhume had specially come across the world to judge the bands, and so they took us everywhere as their guests. Things had altered a good deal since my New Zealand visit of a year or so before. We went across the bush, on the way to Wanganui's river, and passed through thick, jungle-like forests and scenery that made us forget the world behind. I remember we came across one Maori pa, where we got the Maoris to stand and have their photographs taken. I played the violin again, as the thick-haired Maori girls chanted and danced. They have many kinds of dances, and the rhythmical movement of their bodies, is equal to the weird beauty of the South Sea island Siva dances. Some of the Maori girls are exceedingly handsome, but they fade at an early age. I remember one girl who was both handsome and intellectual looking. Her features were delicate and soft, refined through not being too perfect. She had a clear voice, and I extemporized an obligato on my violin as she sang in the chiefs and women were enthusiastic in their applause. One ancient chief was thickly tattooed in engraved ornamental lines and looked exceedingly majestic. He spoke English perfectly, and I was deeply interested in the many things he told us of his younger days. He was a prince by blood and, like the old chief whom I told you of in a preceding chapter, remembered the days when the rival tribes met in battle, or his tribe resented the white man's encroachment. On the tribal lands, I visited North and South Island and saw many of the geysers. Waimana Geyser is often an eruption and throws up volcanic steam and matter 900 feet, and then quiets down. I tramped along in tourist fashion with my gay companion, helped take snapshots, and spoilt a good many. We saw, too, the Waimango Basin, the hot springs and the Devil's Frying Pan, where one could stand up to one's ankles in fire. We stopped with a guide called Warbach and had a fine time. From there we traveled everywhere, and camped out for several nights, just for the romance and fun of it. We cooked our potatoes and boiled eggs in the hot springs of the Karen Geyser. After that, I secured a position as violinist in an orchestra at Auckland and bade Mr. Ordhume goodbye. For soon after he left New Zealand, I will now return once more to my old bohemian days. Away from respectability that whitewashes men, back away from the mighty orchestra of moving cogs and wheels, and from the crowds of cold eyes, thirsting for the gold which is necessary to keep them. Warm and white-collared respectability, back over the seas to the forests of Maoriland, to the cry of the curlew and huya in the trees, by the old paws of Oricon. The old-time warrior sat by the rushing river waters. His tattooed, engraved face is alive with memories. Once again, he tells me of the mighty Rui Maniapoto and the esprit de corps that bound the tribes together in their fierce battles, when Maoris fought as bravely for their rights as the old Britons still do. Still, I fancy I hear pretty Riworo, the Maori maid, singing her chant as she listens to the old chief's reminiscences of mighty deeds and battles of yore. In the birch and eucalyptus trees sigh old winds, and from the mysterious gloom of moonlit Arcadia come soft, weird sounds of Maori musical instruments. I could write chapters about the Maoris and their habits, and their wonderful poetic legends of dead chiefs singing in the forest, and maidens made of sea foam brightly dancing in the glimpse moonlight of forest rivers. I have seen Maoris stare down the main streets of Masterton and swear that they could see the rivers rushing along in the moonlight, and the canoes bearing the tribes over the swirling falls, while Maori maids, with their beautiful hair lifting in the winds, danced on ghostly primeval waters. I have felt as they feel when they see the city spires rising over their enchanted lands, for I can dream as they dream and awake to the same reality. Were I to rise, as a man in a dream, and go back across the years, and pitch my tent on the old spot in Queensland where I camped, I should be moved on for obstructing the tramcars. And yet I am still a young man, so you will see how great is the change in a few years. I remember my self-made hut home, fashioned by my own hands, my comrade pulling the thick bush grass and boughs for the walls. How happy we were in that little room as the river sang, traveling onward. Just below, we picked the ripe yellow oranges from the deep grass under the scented trees, where often my parrot raced me across the slope and flew by me sideways with its cut wing and won the race as I let it pass. I remember how, before the parrot died, it walked up our cabin walls, screaming, with its tongue hanging from its beak. How great was my grief as its tiny jewel eyes opened and closed for the last time. That death was the great sorrow of our hut life, and we buried the poor bird, as parents do a beloved child, by the riverside. We went that same night over the slopes to the camp of Aborigines, who cheered us up as they danced the corroboree, while I played the fiddle under the moonlit gums. The old women were as black as ebony, and they also jumped and beat their hands on their skinny thighs, while old and young men, almost naked, whirled round the smoldering campfire, with their ribs painted white, looking like hideous screaming skeletons. We gave them cakes of plug tobacco, and in return they would dance. Sometimes they would just begin and then stop and say, "Me no dance, want more baccy first." I used to answer, "You no dance." Then me no play music. Then their thick lips would flop together, as they all grinned, and off they would start whirling round in the old brown government blankets which they wore over their shoulders, something after the cavalier fashion of romantic ages. One old fellow had a tremendous head and was the tribal musician. He played a bone flute, the thigh bone of some ancestor. He blew 4 notes on it and played them repeatedly, and the dusky forms chanted and jumped round him, beating their black breasts with their hands. This is how the thigh bone wailed to the lips of its posterity. Those wild black men had creeds and poetic legends of their bush world, much the same as the wild white men. For some historic ancestors deed with the boomerang, filthy old men and women were waited on by the low-caste tribe, who gazed upon their aboriginal gentry with awestruck eyes, and pushed hot, cooked white grubs and eel-like snakes into the big black lips of the aristocrats, who sat by the campfire and opened their huge mouths in a listless way, their black, protruding bellies heaving in the bloated affluence of their high lineage. I am a rolling, rolling stone, stern fashioned in the mold, wherein God recast sand and bone. I glitter with pure gold. His workmanship, of course, not mine. So still, I roll along, a sad old stone half-gemmed Evine, gathering moss and song. God made me, yet I am weak throughout. I feel this as I roll. By deep wild waters knocked about, but like my friend the mole, hid 'neath the earth and flowers, I peep up through a crack and spy another world. From darkness deep, I see a great blue sky. So on, I'll roll and roll, until, on some wild torrent's leap, I fall into the mighty mill, sink in the ocean's deep, to lie quite still as ages fly, 'neath stars up o'er the main, till, brought up by the diver, I'd go rolling on again. From those wild bushlands I passed away into the cities and on 2 ships, then again back to the cities and seaports of the world. I have often thought of the old crews that I sailed with as a boy. I've met them sometimes in grog saloons and sailors' homes in seaport towns of faraway countries. Only some of them, though, for many, went down to the sea in ships and never returned. I have stood alone at night in the far-off seaport's little street and heard the drunken laughter of sailormen by their ships at the wharves below, as I gazed into the windows of the second-hand SLO, pish up at the relics. Old binoculars, compasses, oilskin caps, and big sea boots, hanging on pegs, in rows, for sale. As I looked, a mist crept under the rotting rafters of the dingy, musty, oil-lit room. The old oilskins swelled, and bearded wraiths of dead sailors danced. The big sea boots tumbled about in a jig by the broken window as I watched, and sounds of long-dead laughter echoed in my ears. Then up the little seaport street, from the bay, came a gust of wind, and blew me into the forecastle of a ship far away at sea. I played the fiddle to the dancing dead men and climbed aloft as their hollow voices shouted a muffled, windy chanty. The old skipper, with his hand arched beneath his oilskin sou'wester, looked up aloft and shouted, and we all echoed back, "Aye, aye, sir," and my comrade touched me on the shoulder and said, "Come on, Middleton. You don't want to buy any of those deedy old oilskins." Once more I found myself off, homeward bound round the Horn, crashing and rolling along, the howling sails aloft, singing to the humming winds that we loved to hear. For the harder they blew, the sooner we should be in England. When I arrived in London, the autumn rains were falling, and the population of the mighty city of pavements and stone walls moved along under a myriad umbrellas, as old St. Paul's at flying intervals voiced forth from its mellow iron throat the flight of time. Some musical friends in the city had suggested to me that I should do a wise thing if I went to the fashionable winter resorts in France. The idea struck me as a very good one. I was told that instrumental players had gone to France, Spain, and Italy and come back wealthy. I had seen a good deal of the world at its outposts and had not succeeded in making even a portion of a fortune. So I resolved to get out of England without delay. Before I went, I felt that I must have a comrade. The thought of old age with its boon companion, decrepitude, had always filled me with a strange horror, as something worse than death. And so for old age, I always felt a commiseration and tenderness, which gave me confidence in gray hairs, which often got me into trouble, but more often brought advice and sensible comradeship. When in London, a year or so before, I had made friends with a gentleman whose name was Bonnet. He had been educated in France, was a clever man, and could speak French, Spanish, and Italian. It struck me that if I could find out his whereabouts, I might persuade him to come with me, for he was a jovial man, and his knowledge of French would help me in my travels. To tell you the truth, I was rather short of money, and thought perhaps he might even lend me a little towards the expenses of the trip. I was getting older, and experience had taught me that too much money was not so inconvenient as too little. I went off to his villa in the suburbs. The old place had to let in the window. No one in the district knew of his whereabouts, but at last, just as I was almost disheartened and giving up the thought of finding him, I met a gentleman who had known him. He at once gave me his address and mate, Homerton Workhouse, Hackney. I was very much upset. I knew too well what trials, insults, and sufferings my friend must have experienced before he sought a haven of rest in that terrible inquisition, the English workhouse. I went to The officials treated me most politely. Directly they discovered the reason of my visit. When I told my old comrade I wanted to take him to France as my guest and interpreter, I was considerably affected by his delight. He had aged since I had last seen him. The old stiff military mustachios had turned white and had lost their aristocratic upward twirls. Next day they were once more alert and alive with renewed majesty, and the handsome old face, though deeply wrinkled, was boyish looking with delight. He was a new being in his frock coat and tall hat, which I purchased remarkably cheaply at a pawnbroker's shop. The gloss of his hat was perfection, and as he smoothed it with his sleeve, in the old way, he laughed almost hysterically, with a schoolboy's laughter, but my ear detected the wizened, high note of age in it, and it made him more pathetic than ever. The next day, with his dead wife's photograph and his traveling kit in my box, as steerage passengers, we went down the Thames together, both happy, on board the S.S. Albatross, bound for Bordeaux. Arriving at Bordeaux, we found it advisable, owing to the state of our exchequer, to live outside in the suburbs. So we rented a pretty little chateau in the Rue Vic. The weather was bitterly cold, and we spent a good portion of the day in trying to make our coke fire burn. Every night we walked into Bordeaux and got a good feed in a restaurant. 1 franc 50 centimes secured us several courses, with a bottle of wine each included. I wandered about Bordeaux a good deal, and went down the leafy pathways of the botanical gardens, but could not appreciate anything owing to the cold winds. I had thought to visit spots associated with the old French philosopher, Montaigne, who doubtless in his day wandered over the historic streets where I now walked looking for violin engagements. In my sea chest at our chateau I had Montaigne's essays, and I satisfied myself by lying in my bed and reading the deep, innocent wisdom of the great Frenchman. Near where we lived, there was a wine merchant and many residents who I think worked in the vineyards. From the merchant, we got credit, and things eventually became so bad that we lived for some time on wine and haricot beans. At last I secured a course of concert engagements at English and French clubs and concerts. My comrade and I invited the wine seller and several Frenchmen to supper every night, and the little chateau with Inglis gentlemen in it rang with song as a French harp player and I played. Long after midnight the noise went on. They all lifted their arms and opened their mouths, while Mr. Bonnevard told those chivalrous Frenchmen of his experiences in the siege of Paris. They were delighted with my comrade's yarns, and he went on spinning them vigorously. I could not speak French, so I could only watch their faces, expressing horror or surprise as he fired away. About 2 weeks later, the smash came. The rent of the chateau was 100 francs a month, and was due. We also owed the wine seller for about 100 bottles of red and white wine. It was cheap enough, 4 pence a liter. We could not possibly pay the rent, but we held a hurried and private council and resolved to give our friend the wine seller 50 francs, and send the remainder after we arrived at Biarritz. We dared not give him more, otherwise we should not have our fare. We intended sending the rent to the agent, who was a little Frenchman and lived round the corner. Directly we had some luck, and we did do so. Before we went away, we invited them all to a grand supper, which ended at midnight with the stirring Marseillaise. We had to be at the Midi station by 10 o'clock next morning. The cab arrived. We first went to the agent to tell him we were obliged to leave for the English season at Biarritz, and would send the rent on Biarritz, so off we drove. We had no sooner turned the corner of the street than the agent passed us in a small chaise and spied us and our boxes. About 5 minutes after, we saw him chasing after us, about a quarter of a mile behind, shouting at the top of his voice. "Hadn't we better stop and explain?" I said to my companion. But he would not do so. A whole regiment of gendarmes with drawn swords behind us would not have disturbed him, but would have simply supplied more excitement to the splendor of his label. France, he compared everything that happened around him to his life in the Homerton workhouse, and so rubbed his hands with delight and shouted in French to the driver, who at once whipped up the horse, and away we rumbled at full speed. I painfully felt that we were not in the South Seas, and began to feel uncomfortable when I noticed that the little agent was gaining upon us. I had come to France to make my fortune, and the prospect did not appear much better than it did when I was seeking wealth in the Australian goldfields a few years before. I stood up and shouted to Franks Moore in the driver's ear. He seemed to understand, and gave the poor horse another slash, and as we flew by, the French people rushed from their villas and shops, thinking a fire engine was passing through the maze of Bordeaux streets. We eventually lost sight of the agent, caught the train, and arrived in due course at Biarritz. In Biarritz I did well, played at the casino and gave private concerts at the different clubs and hotels where the wealthy English visitors stayed, the Hôtel de Paris, Hôtel d'Angleterre, and Hôtel du Prince. The British residents consisted of titled folk, high chiefs, princes and princesses, descendants of old tribes of blue-blooded lineage. My comrade was worth his weight in gold. His engaging manner enabled him to take liberties with old colonels, and the austere English set which would have been strongly resented if perpetrated by anyone else. I saw aristocratic old gentlemen flush and clutch their falling eyeglass with astonishment as he smacked them on the back, but they recovered and were amused by his manner, for his appearance and address revealed a personality and intellectual quality equal to their own. We also went to Bayonne, an old-fashioned city surrounded by crumbling ramparts. They had a splendid military band there, and played brilliantly. My companion was so delighted with the change in his affairs that he sang my songs and no one else's as he walked and hummed by my side. Before we left Biarritz, we stayed for a week at the Hotel St. Julien. Mr. Morrison, who ran it, gave a farewell concert on our behalf and refused to accept anything for our stay in his hotel. My comrade loved singing, but had no voice for expressing the love. Mrs. Morrison heroically presided at the piano as he sang, over and over again, the one song which he sang other than my compositions. It was "The Heart Bowed Down with Weight of Woe." Mr. Morrison would clench his teeth and drink a stiff glass of cognac, and then, as the old fellow bowed in a courtly way, encore him. Our host was a clever literary man, and had all the kindness and sincerity of a true bohemian gentleman. My old friend and I were sorry to bid him and his kind wife goodbye. They made us up a hamper of savory food and told us to write to them if we ever got into a tight corner. With about 500 francs in our possession, we crossed the Pyrenees, and after a month's traveling, playing at various concerts and Spanish festivals, we arrived at Madrid. We secured apartments in the old Moorish quarter, then sallied forth and mingled with the swarthy population. The avenues and parks were alive with youths and beautiful dark girls with Arab eyes and glorious dark or bronze hair. Groups of roistering men stood about smoking cigarettes. They looked like a mixture of Italian, Moor, Turk, and Arab, so reminiscent were they of those races. We wandered by the Porto de Sol, and in the crowded streets nearby, an aristocratic, sharp-bearded hidalgos, with large-brimmed sombreros on the heads and cloaks thrown over their shoulders, passed us like cavaliers of the medieval ages. Till I became used to the scene round me, I felt that we walked the streets of some old, lost city, that the sailors of the Spanish Armada still had lovers among the Spanish beauties, who sang in groups as they passed us, wearing short, ornamental skirts and colored kerchiefs, loosely swathing their heads of thick dark hair. The Spaniards gazed over their mantled shoulders with admiring eyes, and the laughing, flattered Spanish maidens reciprocated their gallant attention by gazing back with amorous eyes at their handsome figures, with black velvet breeches, slashed at the sides to reveal pink drawers and frills. The faja sashes of the men vied in vividness of color with the gay swathing of the fair bronzed maids. We strolled on the banks of the Manzanares River by moonlight and seemed to walk through fairyland, though by day hundreds of Spanish women used the river as a washing, and forests of clothes, props, and stretched lines blossomed forth with delicate and beautiful undergarments of silk material. The Hildego's velvet breeches and the maids' fajas fluttered cheerfully side by side in the winds among the chestnut groves, and often the cavaliers and dark-eyed maids that owned them lay tucked in bed till the laundress brought them home, so poor were they. My comrade could speak Spanish fairly well, and kept excitedly telling me so many things that I remembered none of them. In the cheap quarter of the town, where touring violinists and poets generally reside, mysterious smells of garlic and cooking steams killed the romance that hovered about the beautiful terraced architecture of Madrid. I looked in vain for a position as violinist, but it was not to be had, or the salary was only sufficient to enable one to live on garlic. So I was forced to become a Spanish troubadour and go off serenading affluent hidalgo. Fortunately, I very soon replenished our dwindling My comrade, having been educated in France, could bow as royally as the Spanish señors, and conducted all the financial part of the business. We went into partnership with our landlady's daughters, who played the guitar and mandolin, and I conducted the troupe. When the festival carnivals began a week later, we had a glorious time and made enough money to enable us to live comfortably. I played my Samoan waltz, arranging it for 2 violins, guitar and mandolins, and the wild barbarian note of the strain was very popular. Maidens, who looked like Arab girls with shining eyes, whirled and swayed in the arms of their Don Juans. As under the Spanish moon my cheerful troupe tinkled away and I played the violin, except for their artistic gowns and the sashes flapping as they danced, I saw the South Sea Islanders dancing before me. The same abandonment was there. Their musical voices, as they sang the refrain, brought back to me wild tribal dances of the South Sea forest, where a few years before, I had conducted the banging war drums and wedding music for cannibals, high chiefs, dethroned kings and discarded queens. Pretty Mercedes and Mary, her sister, sang minor melodies in duet style, as I extemporized an obligato on my violin. They then danced the Jota Aragonesa and other dances, and little children romped about and imitated bullfights, singing wildly all the time. After the carnival was over, my comrade and I strolled about the sleeping city, and visited the old quarter of alleyways and gloomy buildings and hidden dens where suspicious characters met and loose lovers played guitars and We watched old priests shuffling along to visit the sick señors, who had fed on garlic and walnuts, and lived in Madrid's East End, but dressed in the blue, open days in majestic splendor and vivid color. We went to the many temples of Madrid. They are seldom silent, for up their aisles creep gentle Spanish girls, who come in, cross themselves and kneel in prayer to Jesus and the Holy Virgin. The earnestness of it all would soften the hardest cynic. Old priests abound, and revel in the confessions of those innocent girls, as they bow their heads with shame and confess that they have thought more during the week of Don Juan's lithe figure than of the Holy Virgin. As they pass, one sees them crossing themselves and murmuring their prayers. At the doors, wrinkled old women pester one with little boxes of wax matches, walnuts and photographs of Madrid and the Blessed Virgin. If one buys a cent's worth of anything from them, they follow on for 300 yards, calling down the blessing of God, Jesus and the Virgin on one's head. At nighttime, when the moon is high and the olive trees and palms are windless and still, down the white terraced avenue goes Don Quixote astride his ass, twirling his mustachios till far away, With Sancho Panza by his side, he fades under the moonlit chestnut groves. From the forests of alleyways steal appealing figures, with eyes that beg for an admiring glance, and in strange, soft tones wail of sorrows, and no food or place to lay their weary heads. Give them a coin and pass on. They cross themselves and mention the Holy Virgin's name. And you realize there is something wrong with the world, for the cry of the Virgin's name sounds sincere. All the cities have that frail woman begging the world to be her husband, because she never secured one good man to love her and rear those bonny boys and girls who wail to be born in the infinite shadows behind her. It is a sorrow that has even spread across the world and reached the island tribes of the South Seas. Standing on the garden roof of our house in Madrid, we could see the country round, a barren country, and looking like the Australian Never Never Land in a civilized state. It is dotted with dusty tracks and old isolated inns. Herds of goats and mules fade far across the tracks, looking like droves of rats in the desert distance. There are beautiful spots in Madrid, on the banks of the manzanares and firs. Beaches and chestnuts shade the waters and the slopes by the royal gardens. At night I used to lie in my attic room and listen to the nightingales singing in the chestnut tree outside my window, its mate piping back approval from another tree at regular intervals. My old comrade lay fast asleep on the next trestle bed, for the Spanish hidalgos gave him cognac, and on the way home from the festival concerts he would clutch me tightly by the arm, as little Mercedes and Mary laughed by my side. In the morning he used to say, "Dear boy, whatever was it that overcame me last night? It's that wretched garlic." Sometimes, when we were short of money, we lay on our beds smoking, and he would tell me of the siege of Paris, his terrible experiences there, and how he ate his share of the elephant and lion steaks from the zoo. Becoming philosophical, he would tell me of his boyish aspirations, the happiness he got out of them, and the worry from the events that never happened. I would say, "Supposing we run right out of money, what about food and a bed?" Then he would cheer me up by saying, "My dear boy, all's sure to be well. We are certain to be somewhere and sleep somewhere, whatever happens." Then, as was his wont, he would lick his thumb and push the old cigar stump into his pipe, and hum my last melody, a melody that no publisher would buy till I, secure in his philosophical comradeship, fell asleep. He never professed or spoke on religious matters, but each night he knelt by his bed before he got in and lit his pipe. We were very happy in the house of Señora Dolores. She treated us as though we were dear relatives. In her little attic room, I spent the happiest hours of my continental travels. I lay half the night reading my beloved Montaigne's essays. The old French Shakespeare was my best dead-learned friend. If ever I was worried and could not sleep for thinking, I went to my sea chest and brought him out. I read some of his essays over 20 times, but they were always fresh, wise, and sincere, and I still read them. In that little room, I also read poetry's legitimate child, Keats. As my dear comrade slept on, I fell in love with Madeline, and roamed with Endymion, Lamia, and Hyperion. The nightingale singing outside, charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands forlorn. As the moonlight glimmered through my little room, I have read somewhere that Keats was earthly. I think if he had lived, his intense genius would have fought for the sorrows of humanity, and his marvelous mind made literature and our country even better than it is. It may be centuries before Earth, capable of bringing forth such spiritual flowers as his earthliness did, will be born again. Poor little Mercedes. She crossed herself and murmured the Holy Virgin's name many times as we bade her and her sister goodbye. And I thought of Madeline, and felt sad that the days of gallant knights and amorous warriors were gone forever. I can still see their eyes shining through sorrow as we said farewell. Even the old mother's wrinkled face blushed as we kissed the three. We went from Madrid to Valencia, where we stayed for 3 weeks, and then left by boat for Marseille, and then on to Nice, and finally to Genoa. My comrade was the happiest of men as he tramped beside me. He loved to carry my violin. We started to write an opera together, entitled The Siege of Paris. He was delighted as he gave me thrilling, realistic details of all he had witnessed. I tried to place them in lyrical form, and wrote suitable melodies round the tragic events. He knew as much about authorship as I did, But I believe, with the help of his clever head and earnestness, we should have amply made up for our artistic deficiencies and lack of literary method. The manuscript still remains unfinished, as we left it, for not long after he ceased singing my songs. The brief sunlight between the workhouse and the grave faded and disappeared. When I turned away from his last resting place, I was the only mourner. And as I went away into our mysterious world once more, I felt very lonely. So end the intimate reminiscences of my wanderings, most of them experiences up to my 22nd birthday. Whether I have succeeded in giving the reader an insight into the personality of the writer, such a glimpse as an autobiography is supposed to give, I do not know. Personally, I think it is a hard thing to do in a thorough sense, especially for a vagabond at heart. Each individual is a multitude of struggling ancestral strains, and real active life is manifested in the fight, the fierce hunt to find ourselves, which we can never do, for we die every moment that we live. So all we can attempt in a book is to tell truthfully those things that impressed us deeply at different periods of our life, so deeply that they still remain imprinted on the mind. Also to tell of our experiences, for better or worse, in this life of ours, where one footstep taken out of the track that we have known and write about would have altered the whole book of our life to another color.